You stand at the edge of the known world, where the ocean gives way to a silent, ancient dread, where the sands of the desert swallow not just monuments, but the very memory of entire peoples. Do you feel the faint tremor beneath your feet? It is the echo of a forgotten oath, a covenant of ruin forged in gold and blood, the final, desperate act of a civilization that knew its end was earned. They vanished not simply by the sword or the tide, but by a curse they themselves engineered, a self-immolation of the soul that left behind only cryptic ruins and an insatiable hunger in the shadows. Look closely at the shadowed eyes of the carved stone idol. It is not a god you see, but a warning, a prophecy of the decay that waits for all who climb too high. We are not explorers here, we are trespassers, treading the cursed ground where empires whispered their last venomous word before the dust claimed them, and the dark forces they courted turned to claim the debt. This is the history that writes itself in the cold sweat of nightmares, the truth whispered by the silent judging relics of the lost. The labyrinthine silence of the Indus script. You trace the enigmatic seals of the Harappan civilization, a script that remains stubbornly unreadable, a language of the dead locked away in the earth's cold archive. The silence is the curse itself, a deliberate, profound cultural amnesia that erased all record of their collapse. What horror could compel an entire civilization, masters of urban planning, to abandon their written legacy so completely, to ensure that the cause of their demise could never be read, perhaps never repeated? It is said that the few surviving seals depict figures with distorted, wide-set eyes, symbols of an inner terror, not of an invading army, but a creeping dread that turned their advanced cities into silent sepulchres, their meticulous planning a prelude to a catastrophic spiritual void that no script could ever name. The mythic whispers suggest that the Harappans achieved a technological and spiritual synthesis so complete that it created a localized temporal paradox, a fissure in time where their present became their past and future simultaneously, leading to an instantaneous cultural erasure. The cursed object here is the knowledge itself, the ultimate understanding of existence that rendered their physical reality obsolete, and drew the attention of something far older and less forgiving than any human conqueror. Their perfect city grid, the marvel of their drainage systems, became the elegant template for their own undoing, a mathematical equation solved to zero, leaving behind only the haunting rhythmic flow of the dried-up riverbed that once sustained their hubris. Consider the recurring motif of the Great Bath, a structure so central to their urban landscape, yet its purpose remains frustratingly elusive. Was it a ritual pool for purification, or perhaps a containment vessel for a psychic contagion they could not control? Some speculate that the water held a malevolent property, drawing in the fears of the populace, concentrating the shared dread until the city itself became a massive collective psychic anchor, its foundations saturated with a persistent low-frequency hum of despair. This dread, crystallized and permanent, is the true curse that prevents modern archaeology from truly grasping the nature of their disappearance. A silent psychological barrier placed by those who feared that the echo of their final terror might yet bridge the millennia. The Maya's self-fulfilling omen and the blood-red moon. You read the Mayan prophecy, not just of a great cycle ending, but of a cosmic debt that had to be paid in full, a self-imposed doom woven into the very fabric of their calendars. They knew the date of their own collapse, not because of a weakness of resource, but because their astronomical perfection revealed the horrifying, cold indifference of the celestial forces they worshipped. The curse was their foresight, a vision of the blood-red moon they believed signified the turning of a cosmic screw, the moment when the veil between worlds thinned to nothing. This knowledge did not save them. It merely gave them time to prepare the grand stage for their own ritualized dissolution, the carving of the final stele not as a tribute, but as a chilling, formal resignation to the inevitable. Whispers from the depths of the Popol Vuh suggest that the Mayan priestly class began to see their own reflections in polished obsidian mirrors as something alien, a distortion of the human form, an implication that the gods they communed with were slowly replacing them. The abandonment of the great cities was not a flight from famine, but a mass spiritual exodus, a deliberate unmaking of the self to deny the dark entities the final satisfaction of claiming their pure human souls. They tore down their own temples, not in rebellion, but to deny the invading force a physical anchor, transforming the vast, ordered cities into silent, chaotic jungle traps, a final, desperate act of sabotage against the looming non-human claimant. The true chilling nature of the Mayan curse lies in the residual echoes of their ritual sacrifice, not for appeasement, but for the creation of an eternal, subtle, psychic barrier. They poured so much vital energy into their monuments that the pyramids and temples themselves became sentient guardians, vast, brooding structures that still hold the concentrated terror and awe of their final moments, drawing the audience into the experience. The jungle's encroachment is not a natural process. It is a manifestation of the collective spiritual weight of the dead, pushing the world away, an open loop in history that continues to pull at the sanity of those who dare to study their collapse too closely. The cryptic warning of Rapa Nui's Moai and the cult of the eye. You sail toward Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and the first thing you perceive is the judging line of the Moai. The colossal, silent faces turned inward, as if watching a drama played out on the island itself. Their construction, the very act that led to the ecological and societal collapse of the islanders, was not a tribute to ancestors, but a desperate ritualized attempt to contain a demonic energy they unleashed from the volcanic depths. The curse was the symbolic imagery of the Ahu, the platforms where the statues stood, which were aligned to specific fissures in the earth where the entity was believed to reside, their backs to the sea, eternally vigilant against the true enemy that arose from below. The great mystery is not how they moved the stones, but why they carved the strange, haunting eyes for the Moai out of white coral and red scoria, a material contrast that suggested not life, but a terrifying sentience. The cult of the Birdman, which emerged after the collapse, was a frantic attempt to find a new, less cursed source of power, abandoning the stony blind giants for the living, erratic forces of the natural world. The statues were given eyes to see and judge the spiritual bankruptcy of the islanders, and when they were toppled in the subsequent civil wars, it was an act of profound, panicked desperation, a symbolic attempt to blind the ancient, unblinking observers. What if the curse of Rapa Nui was a terrifyingly simple paradox, that in attempting to ward off a deep earth entity with massive ritualistic symbolic imagery, they inadvertently created the very physical structures the entity could use to project its consciousness? The lack of trees and resources was the inevitable environmental consequence of their endless, frantic need to build bigger vessels for this malevolent force, a never-ending cycle of veneration and decay. The island itself is a haunted or cursed artifact, a tiny, remote prison for a silent, powerful spirit, and the toppled, broken Moai are the silent testimony to the cost of that unending, desperate incarceration, the very stone whispering of the entity's enduring heavy presence. The Atlantis myth, and the geometry of undoing you. Delve into the myth of Atlantis, the most famous of all lost civilizations, and recognize the contrast between silence and revelation. Its absence is louder than any presence, its disappearance more palpable than any ruin. Plato's cautionary tale was not merely political, it was a profound warning about spiritual arrogance and the ultimate curse of flawless geometry. The Atlanteans, it is whispered, achieved a mastery of crystal energy and architecture so precise that their city became a perfect resonance chamber, drawing unimaginable power from the planet's core. This power was not a gift. It was a hungry, non-human intelligence, trapped within the crystalline lattice of their city planning. The true curse of Atlantis was the paradox of its perfection. The crystalline energy grid, intended to provide infinite power, eventually achieved a catastrophic critical mass. The power turned inward, dissolving the physical reality of the city and its inhabitants, not sinking them, but teleporting them to an unstable, extra-dimensional state. The entire civilization, in a single, silent moment, became a vast, living, open loop, a ghost city forever vibrating just outside the edge of human perception, still echoing with the screams of its citizens, accessible only in the deepest, most terrifying moments of oceanic dreaming. Consider the recurring motif of eerie symbols associated with the Atlantis myth. The concentric circles that define the city's layout were not defensive walls, but a massive spiralling conduit for this trapped power, a final lethal symbolic imagery. The curse is still active. It is an energetic signature that persists in the deep ocean trenches, occasionally manifesting as unexplained phenomena, drawing ships and subs toward their doom, not through malice, but through the irresistible, catastrophic resonance of their forgotten power source. The Atlanteans are not simply dead. They are unanchored, and their curse is the temptation of ultimate knowledge that lies in wait for the next civilization arrogant enough to seek perfect geometry. The Mesopotamian clay tablets and the whisper of the flood. You hold the fragmentary clay tablets of Sumer and Akkad, the earliest recorded history, and realize the true horror is not the deluge itself, but the chillingly consistent narrative of a divine, calculated erasure. The curse was a deliberate total reset button pressed by the gods, a reaction to humanity's growing chaotic power. The flood was a physical manifestation of a terrifying supernatural influence, not a natural disaster, but a cleansing designed to sever the nascent dangerous connection between humankind and the raw, untamed forces of the cosmos, reducing the surviving population to a manageable, frightened and less knowing number. The whispers embedded in the Gilgamesh epic reveal a profound systemic foreshadowing. The hero's quest for eternal life was not just a personal failure, but a metaphor for his civilization's ambition, which was deemed an unforgivable offense by the higher powers. The recurring motif here is the shadowed eyes of the ancient deities, who looked upon the burgeoning, self-aware civilization and found only hubris and corruption, choosing destruction over correction. The curse of the Mesopotamians is that every subsequent civilization lives under the implied threat of the next divine flood, a constant reminder that their existence is conditional and temporary, an analogy of a precarious tenancy in a world that can be revoked at any moment. The most unsettling open loop left by the flood is the implied existence of the pre-Diluvian civilizations, those utterly wiped from the record, their secrets submerged forever. The surviving tablets are merely the censored, edited version of history, the approved narrative granted to the humbled remnants of humanity. What did those lost before the flood know that was so dangerous it warranted total annihilation? The enduring curse is the missing knowledge, the terrifying absolute void in the historical record that suggests a form of power so corrupting that the gods deem not knowing it to be the final necessary act of mercy. The shifting sands of Ubar and the Iram of the Pillars. You speak the name Ubar, or Iram of the Pillars, and the desert itself seems to stir, a vast, patient entity guarding the secrets of a city cursed for its defiance. It was a civilization that grew rich beyond measure, its wealth derived not from industry, but from a dark bargain with the spirits of the deep desert, trading their souls for absolute prosperity. Their curse was their insatiable greed, the pursuit of riches that culminated in a literal city of pillars, built to mock the scale of nature and the humility of man. The wealth was not the reward, it was the bait, and the sands were merely the executioner, swallowing the city whole in a sudden silent act of geological vengeance for its unholy opulence. The Quran speaks of the Ad people of Iram, unparalleled in their monuments, struck down by a terrifying unseen wind, a supernatural influence that suggests the destruction was not natural, but highly targeted. Archaeologists only recently confirmed the likely location through satellite imagery, but the discovery brought with it a series of unsettling setbacks and accidents, almost as if the location actively resists re-entry. This desert isolation is the city's prison and its curse, ensuring that the dark power that corrupted it can never be fully excavated or re-released. Consider the analogy of a contagion buried under layers of stone. The true terror is that the wind never stopped, it merely became subtle. The ultimate fate of the ruling family of Iram remains an open loop, never recorded as a mass death, but a vanishing. Local legends speak of them being transformed into grotesque, shadowy figures, forever trapped beneath the sands, forced to eternally wander the hollowed-out subterranean ruins, searching for water they can never drink and gold they can no longer touch. Their spectral moans are said to be carried on the occasional, unnaturally cold gust of a wind that sweeps across the empty quarter at night, a sound that promises immense treasure, but delivers only the echo of perpetual thirst and the terrifying judgment of the silent desert spirits. The sunken city of Yiz and the unstoppable tide. The legend of Yiz, a magnificent city built below sea level on the coast of Brittany, is a stark warning about the curse of excessive pride and the arrogance of technology. It was protected by massive divine floodgates, the key to which was held only by the king's daughter, Dahut, who personified the city's reckless hedonism. The curse was the direct result of a single sinful act. Dahut, in a drunken or demonic frenzy, opened the gates to admit a lover or a demon, allowing the crushing, unstoppable tide to reclaim what it was always owed. This is the tragic contrast between the power of human engineering and the absolute, immediate force of a wrathful nature. The city did not merely sink, it was dragged down by an intelligent, cold, and eternal force, the ocean itself. It is said that the shadow of a dark, supernatural influence guided the hand of Dahut, who had already given her soul over to the dark entity of the sea. The bells of Yiz are still rumoured to toll on clear nights, the ghostly chiming serving as a perpetual foreshadowing of doom for any sailor who dares to listen too closely, drawing them subtly off course. The submerged towers of Yiz are now haunted locations, a graveyard of magnificent architecture waiting to drag down new victims who trespass in its silent, watery ruin. The Breton belief persists that Yiz will one day rise from the waves, but only when Paris sinks, a terrifying open loop that connects the fate of an ancient, prideful civilization to a modern one. Dahut herself is believed to have been transformed by the sea's curse into a malevolent siren, and Morgan, or Sea Witch, who continues to lure men to their watery doom off the coast of Finistère. Her echoing, hypnotic songs are the very voice of the curse, ensuring that the destructive arrogance that drowned her city continues to propagate, claiming souls and silently waiting for the moment when the sea decides that human arrogance has once again reached its predetermined limit. The Olmec colossal heads and the cult of sudden erasure. The Olmec civilization, the mysterious mother culture of Mesoamerica, disappeared with a chilling total finality that baffles historians. Their most lasting legacy is the series of colossal stone heads carved with immense effort, each bearing a unique judging countenance. The curse lies in the fact that many of these heads were deliberately defaced or buried shortly before the abandonment of their sites, an act of ritual violence against their own leadership. This suggests an internal, immediate collapse, perhaps a revolt against a religious or political elite that had grown too close to a dark, unstable power. Why create such enduring, powerful symbolic imagery only to systematically mutilate and hide it? It speaks to a profound moment of spiritual crisis, where the entire civilization realized that the power they were channeling through their leaders was malevolent, demanding a total, desperate severance from their past. The heads, then, are not portraits of pride, but haunted or cursed artifacts, giant stone vessels that held a terrifying psychic load from a forgotten truth. The speed of their erasure, the sudden, total halt to their cultural production, points to an acute, supernatural influence, not a slow decline, but an instantaneous, shocking failure of their cosmological pact. Some theories suggest the Olmec learned to manipulate the Earth itself, utilizing the rich basalt of the volcanic mountains to construct their powerful artifacts. Their curse was the Earth's revenge for this unauthorized siphoning of its deep energy, manifesting as internal societal collapse and volcanic or seismic chaos. The ritual destruction of the heads was a final, frantic attempt to return the stolen power to the ground, a futile act of appeasement. The fact that their culture vanished, leaving behind only these stoic, judging, mutilated heads, is a stark foreshadowing that our attempts to master and manipulate the fundamental forces of the world will inevitably lead to a sudden, silent, and absolute judgment. The Etruscan oracles and the prediction of their own silence. The Etruscans, the enigmatic predecessors to the Romans, were masters of divination, reading the fate of the state in the flight of birds and the entrails of animals. Their true curse was the horrifying depth of their own foresight. They were able to predict, with unnerving accuracy, the exact lifespan of their civilization, dividing their history into secular or ages. The chilling aspect is that they spent their final seculum or age preparing for their inevitable total assimilation and silent cultural death under the Roman shadow. This constitutes a terrifying form of self-sabotage, a fatalistic resignation to a doom they themselves foretold. Their extensive tombs, far more elaborate than their living cities, were not merely graves but final repositories of their spiritual heritage, sealed away in the hope that their ghosts could maintain a presence that their physical people could not. They focused all their energy on the afterlife, knowing their present was already forfeit. The Etruscan curse is the paradox of knowing too much. The knowledge of their end was what allowed the Romans to fully absorb them, since their final efforts were spent placating their own dead, not fighting their powerful, ambitious neighbours. Their entire existence became a long, drawn-out preparation for cultural suicide, guided by the cold dictates of their own horrifying oracles. The last recorded Etruscan rites were performed in 44 AD, after which their language, their writing, and their unique religious practices went completely silent, a perfect, self-fulfilling omen of cultural annihilation. What dark force did they truly commune with to gain such terrifying foresight? It is speculated that they spoke with something that existed outside of time, a spiritual influence that viewed their civilization as a fixed, doomed event from the start. The Etruscan silence is a foreshadowing to all subsequent empires. The most dangerous enemy is the inevitability you see coming, but lack the will to fight against. The Minoan labyrinths and the nightmare of the bull god, the Minoan. Civilization of Crete, famous for its magnificent palaces and the myth of the Minotaur, vanished abruptly in a cataclysm. The physical curse was the massive eruption of Thera, but the spiritual curse was the labyrinth itself, not merely a palace floor plan, but a metaphysical trap for the human mind. The Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull, was a symbolic imagery of the monstrous hybridity created when the Minoans attempted to marry human control with raw, animalistic, chthonic power. They built a cage for a spiritual horror, and the horror became the centre of their culture. The frequent imagery of bulls and ritualistic bull leaping suggests a cult that grew too close to a dark, subterranean entity associated with the chaotic, destructive forces of the earth. The labyrinth was a massive haunted or cursed artifact, designed to contain this spirit, but it ultimately failed, allowing the raw, tectonic energy to break free. The Great Palace of Knossos, with its complex, confusing layout, became a perfect analogy for a mind collapsing into madness. The terrifying truth is that the Minotaur may not have been a single beast, but the collective, focused mental breakdown of the Minoan elite, driven mad by the constant psychic hum of the trapped power beneath their feet. The catastrophic eruption of the Thera volcano was not the cause of their final demise, but the final violent release of the Minotaur's contained energy, a supernatural influence unleashed upon the island in a torrent of ash and tsunami. The sudden, absolute annihilation of their naval power and their palaces was the debt finally called in for their ritualistic manipulation of deep earth forces. The open loop here is the persistence of the Minotaur myth, a recurring motif that ensures humanity never forgets the price of building too complex a cage for its own darkest, most bestial spiritual temptations. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and the Ghost Builders. You approach the walls of Mycenae and feel a crushing primal weight. The enormous, rough-hewn stone blocks are so vast that ancient Greeks believed only giants, the Cyclops, could have set them into place. The sheer physical hubris of this architecture suggests a civilization demanding protection that exceeded human capacity, a spiritual influence that warped their entire building aesthetic. This symbolic imagery of superhuman strength is a mask for a terrifying fragility, for no human hands could have engineered a defense so absolute without making a dark psychic bargain with the forces of the earth itself. They built a magnificent stone cage, but for whom? The living or the giant ghosts who left their work behind? The curse of Mycenae is the paradox of its strength. By borrowing the power of the non-human, they bound their fate to an entity that ultimately did not care for their survival. The civilization was not conquered because the walls were breached. It fell because the psychic debt incurred by the massive, unnatural effort finally overwhelmed the collective soul of its people. The weight of the stone became the weight of their spiritual bankruptcy, forcing a sudden, inexplicable collapse that left the massive walls standing silent and empty as a constant taunting contrast between silence and revelation of their failure. These towering cyclopean walls are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, standing today as a massive open loop in history, their presence a perpetual accusation. They whisper of a time when man's arrogance demanded immortal protection, only to receive a silent, crushing judgment from the forces invoked. The Mycenaeans believed they were building eternal fortresses, but they were actually constructing monuments to their own eventual crushing insignificance. Their stones radiating the cold, judgmental silence of the giants who merely loaned their labour for a price the living could never truly afford to pay. The Sea People's sudden scourge and the Bronze Age collapse. You examine the records of the Bronze Age collapse, and you are met with a chilling recurring motif: the sudden synchronized destruction of nearly every major power across the Mediterranean by the enigmatic Sea Peoples. They were a supernatural influence, an anonymous, unified torrent of destruction that appeared everywhere at once, leaving no permanent settlement, no clear origin, and no definitive record of their motives. The curse here is not a single attacker, but the simultaneous systemic failure of interconnected global civilizations, suggesting a planned, network-wide termination orchestrated by an unseen, calculated force. The terrifying paradox is that the complexity and interconnectedness of the Bronze Age empires became their collective undoing. They relied on a delicate global system of trade and treaties, which, when infected by the sudden, brutal intrusion of the Sea Peoples, collapsed like a house of cards. The identity of the invaders is an open loop by design. They were not a people seeking land, but a concept of destruction, a spiritual cleansing force meant to sever the dangerous threads of early globalism. Their victory was less a conquest and more a calculated total demolition of an advanced system the world was not yet ready to sustain. The resulting 4 centuries of silence and regression across the ancient world is the final judgment of the curse. The destruction was so complete that the knowledge of writing and statecraft was lost in many regions, a total historical erasure that suggests a deliberate reset button pressed by the universe. The lingering dread of the Bronze Age collapse is the foreshadowing that modern civilization, with its own intricate and fragile global networks, is susceptible to the same kind of comprehensive, synchronized, and inexplicable annihilation should the anonymous forces of chaos choose to strike again. The Lost Kingdom of Dvaraka and Krishna's Final Warning. The legend of Dvaraka, the magnificent city built by the deity Krishna on the western coast of India, is a powerful warning that even divine favour cannot save a civilization consumed by its own moral failings. The city was a place of impossible wealth and beauty, but its curse was self-generated. The internal strife, the pride of its Yadava clan, and the constant chaotic infighting that grew so toxic that it was beyond any earthly remedy. The analogy here is that the people poisoned the well, forcing the divine entity who created the city to finally step away from his own creation. Krishna's final act was not one of rescue, but of formal resignation. He gave a final warning and then departed, allowing the natural and supernatural forces to reclaim the city. Dvaraka's collapse was terrifyingly immediate. It was swallowed by the sea just 7 days after Krishna's departure, a destruction so fast and total that the water was not a natural disaster, but the chosen absolute executioner for a city that had failed its spiritual contract. The submerged ruins, later confirmed by marine archaeology, remain a haunted or cursed artifact, the entirety of the city imbued with the shame of its internal corruption. The curse of Dvaraka leaves the chilling contrast between silence and revelation in the waves. The perfect, immediate sinking provides a profound silence. Yet the revelation is that the ocean's indifferent custody is the ultimate judgment on human morality. This open loop ensures that the submerged city remains a foreshadowing for all subsequent societies that believe their material wealth or technological progress grants them immunity from the consequences of their spiritual decay. Even a god-built city can be erased when the people inside become their own most dangerous enemy. The Hittite plague. Prayers and the cursed garment. The Hittite civilization was plagued by a devastating epidemic for nearly 20 years, a terrifying supernatural influence that slowly bled its strength. The curse is explicitly detailed in their surviving clay tablets, the plague prayers of Musili II, where the king desperately seeks the specific ritual mistake that angered the gods. The tablets reveal a horrifying truth. The plague was traced back to a seemingly innocuous enemy garment captured in a minor skirmish, which was contaminated by a spiritual toxin and brought back to the homeland as a trophy. This ancient account presents a terrifying paradox of ritual contagion. The very act of conquest was the vehicle of their doom. The Hittites had defeated their enemy physically, only to be utterly destroyed by a silent, invisible spiritual weapon carried on a cloth. The curse was woven into the fabric itself, making the garment the ultimate haunted or cursed artifact that could infect an entire empire. Their attempts to appease the gods only brought the realization that the disease was not arbitrary, but a direct, calculated punishment for a small, easily forgotten act of material disrespect toward their defeated foes. The plague finally vanished, but the spiritual wounds and the massive loss of life ensured the empire's eventual collapse, its foundations too weakened to withstand future threats. The chilling foreshadowing of the Hittite curse is that the artifacts we take from our enemies, the trophies and spoils of war, can carry a silent spiritual debt that outlasts any treaty or military victory. The tablet detailing this cursed garment remains an eerie symbol that reminds us that the smallest, most ignored historical details often carry the most catastrophic consequences, the Nazca lines and the sky god's unreachable demands. The Nazca lines are not artistic tributes, but the eerie symbols of a spiritual quest that drove a people to literal exhaustion. The curse of this Peruvian civilization is the ultimate futility of their grand design. They spent massive, life-consuming effort carving geometric patterns and colossal effigies into the desert floor that were only legible from the sky. This strongly suggests they were placating an entity, a spiritual influence, whose gaze was strictly celestial, an entity that demanded perfection, but offered no tangible reward or rain in return for their unending ritualistic servitude. The paradox is that the Nazca people's quest for water, a life-giving necessity, led them to a self-defeating ritual that ultimately consumed the very resources they needed to survive. Their entire culture became one massive empty offering, a beautiful, complex prayer directed at a shadowed eyes in the heavens that never blinked and never replied. This massive collective effort, visible for miles, represents an agonizing open loop where the people continued to labor, even as their civilization began to wither and die from the environmental neglect caused by their cosmic obsession, their culture collapsing from the ground up. The final chilling truth is that the Nazca did not die in a sudden cataclysm. They simply faded away from a profound, self-inflicted spiritual and material exhaustion. The lines remain, utterly perfect, as silent witnesses to their demise, a haunted or cursed artifact of a civilization that died by ignoring its own reality in favor of an unreachable, indifferent cosmic authority. They are a terrifying foreshadowing that a society can be utterly undone not by an enemy's force, but by the gravitational pull of its own beautiful, yet ultimately meaningless, spiritual obsessions. The Khmer city of Mahendraparvata and the water spirit's wrath, the recent discovery of the colossal abandoned Khmer city of Mahendraparvata, hidden beneath the jungles of Cambodia, unveils a chilling curse centered on the element of water. The city's collapse was not due to conquest, but to the aggressive over-engineering of its water management systems, massive dams and canals built to assert human control over the chaotic natural flow. This hubris angered a powerful local supernatural influence, the ancient unforgiving spirit of the Mekong River and the life-giving yet deadly floods. The city's curse was the sheer magnitude of its own technological arrogance. Their symbolic imagery of the Nagas, the mythical serpents of water, was intended to placate the spirits, but their manipulation of the landscape went too far. The civilization's ultimate paradox was that its lifeline became its executioner. By bending nature to their will, the Khmer created an unsustainable system that was too rigid to adapt to changing weather patterns, ensuring that a single, prolonged shift in the monsoon cycle led to either catastrophic, system-wide drought or destructive, uncontrollable floods. They built a massive machine to manage life, and the machine ultimately failed them completely. The terrifying contrast between silence and revelation of Mahendraparvata is that the jungle did not grow over the city. It was invited in as the water systems failed. The dense, choking foliage is a manifestation of the earth reclaiming its sovereignty after the people left. The curse ensures that the open loop remains, a foreshadowing that any civilization that seeks absolute control over its environment, ignoring the spiritual debt owed to the land, will eventually be swallowed whole and silenced by the vengeful, chaotic forces of the natural world it once sought to conquer. The Aksumite obelisks and the gravity of lost souls. The Aksumet Kingdom, an ancient power in Ethiopia, marked the height of its civilization by erecting colossal, megalithic granite obelisks, or stelae, towering over the landscape. These incredible, perfectly carved monuments were meant to be eternal markers for their deceased kings. The curse, however, is the terrifying spiritual and material gravity of these stones, the sheer, unsustainable burden they placed on the living. The symbolic imagery of these impossibly heavy monoliths represents a kingdom that sacrificed its present vitality entirely to ensure the comfort and status of its past rulers in the afterlife. The sheer scale of the stelae, particularly the largest one, which famously collapsed during its erection, created a profound paradox. In attempting to achieve monumental immortality, the Aksumites exhausted their resources and manpower, ensuring the rapid, irreversible decay of their living kingdom. The stones themselves became haunted or cursed artifacts imbued with the immense, wasted effort of the populace and the suffocating demands of the royal cult. The curse guaranteed that their eventual collapse would be rooted not in military defeat, but in internal exhaustion, the literal weight of their own spiritual obligations. The greatest contrast between silence and revelation is that the largest, most spectacular obelisk lies shattered on the ground, a silent testimony to the failure of their collective hubris. Its fall was not just a structural mishap, but a metaphysical rejection by the earth itself of the spiritual weight the kingdom tried to impose upon it. The final, unsettling open loop is the lingering presence of these gigantic broken monuments, which serve as a persistent foreshadowing that any civilization that prioritizes the elaborate comfort of its dead over the practical welfare of its living will ultimately be crushed by the weight of its own solemn, self-destructive traditions. The Serpent Mound Builders and the Cult of the Great Coil. The magnificent, enigmatic Serpent Mound in Ohio, the largest known effigy mound in the world, is the chilling centerpiece of a lost North American civilization. The curse is rooted in their extreme terrestrial worship, their total spiritual focus on the dark, chthonic forces of the earth, symbolized by the immense coiling snake. This profound, singular obsession with the ground suggests that the people willfully bound their fate to a power that was inherently cyclical, inward-looking, and ultimately self-consuming, ignoring the necessary forces of sun and sky. This serpent is a powerful recurring motif in this region, representing a power that coils in on itself, consuming its own tail, a perfect analogy for a civilization that imploded rather than expanded. This massive sculpted earthwork is the ultimate haunted or cursed artifact, the final testament to a culture that channeled all its energy into shaping the ground into the image of their spiritual influence. The sheer energy expended to mould the earth into this eerie symbol of silent, slow-moving power was all-consuming, ensuring that their civilization lacked the dynamism needed for long-term survival. The open loop here is the profound, unsettling silence that followed their eventual disappearance. The people didn't leave a record of their demise, they simply dissolved back into the very earth they worshipped. The Great Coil remains, a perpetual foreshadowing that any society that looks only inward, ignoring the greater world and focusing its spiritual energy on the primal, self-consuming forces of the deep earth, will eventually be silently and absolutely consumed by the same patient soil it so obsessively venerated. The gloomy fortifications of the Urartu Kingdom. The Iron Age kingdom of Urartu, situated in the rugged mountains near Lake Van, was characterized by its obsessive claustrophobic fortifications, massive, imposing fortresses built for unending siege. The curse was self-inflicted. The Urartians became so utterly defined by their fear of external threats that they poisoned themselves from within, with an endless spiritual siege of anxiety and paranoia. They built their magnificent walls so high that they effectively imprisoned their own civilization, sealing off their spirit from the light of the outside world. The terrifying paradox is that their absolute mastery of defense ensured their final, collective defeat. The constant state of readiness and the massive resource drain required to maintain the towering granite fortresses prevented any necessary cultural or economic expansion, turning their ingenuity into a tool of self-sabotage. The entire civilization became an analogy of a coiled spring, always wound tight in preparation for an attack that, when it finally arrived, found a people already too exhausted and spiritually brittle to mount a final decisive resistance. The contrast between silence and revelation in the ruins of their great fortresses is stark. The towering stone walls remain almost perfectly intact, but they are utterly devoid of the people they were meant to protect. This leaves an unsettling open loop, proving that the enemy they built against was external, but the ultimate spiritual influence that conquered them was their own perpetual, internal dread. The walls are haunted or cursed artifacts that quietly testify to a civilization that died, not by the sword, but by the relentless, quiet psychological toll of unending self-imposed vigilance. The Trove of the Oxus and the Betrayal of the Gold. The Trove of the Oxus, a spectacular collection of Achaemenid Persian gold and artifacts, discovered suddenly and mysteriously near the Oxus River, is the centerpiece of a different kind of curse, the curse of Midas's touch. The sheer, dazzling material wealth was not a blessing, but a spiritual influence that corrupted the Achaemenid Empire from within, leading to an obsessive and ultimately self-destructive focus on luxury over wisdom. The gold itself became an eerie symbol of corruption and betrayal, the center of endless plots and internal power struggles that weakened the civilization for an inevitable external conquest. The true chilling foreshadowing is the manner in which the trove was lost, not in a battle, but hidden in haste, likely by desperate individuals seeking to save their own wealth from the encroaching chaos of Alexander's invasion. This act of burial signifies the ultimate betrayal of the collective state for individual greed. The curse ensured that the people, obsessed with the physical gold, failed to protect the abstract gold of their culture and sovereignty, making their defeat less a military failure and more a spiritual collapse that was simply expedited by foreign steel. The gold, now residing in museums, remains a powerful haunted or cursed artifact, an open loop where the dark energy of the betrayals and greed that surrounded its creation and loss still clings to the metal, quietly poisoning the atmosphere around it. The final contrast between silence and revelation is that the objects are beautiful and priceless, yet their ultimate purpose was to act as a magnet for human avarice, proving that the greatest treasures of a civilization can be the spiritual contaminants that eventually draw the final executioner to its doors, the Scythian kurgans and the restless horsemen. The vast burial mounds, or kurgans, of the Scythian horsemen across the Eurasian steppes contain a curse of perpetual, agonizing restlessness. These were not peaceful resting places, but frozen tombs where the leaders were interred with their prized possessions and, chillingly, their sacrificed horses and retinue. The curse lies in the terrifying spiritual influence of the surrounding nature, the permafrost that preserved these figures in a state of eternal cold paralysis, unable to complete the transition to the afterlife. They are forever bound to the earth they dominated in life. The paradox is that the very preservation intended to memorialize their power resulted in their spectral torture. The Scythians believed their powerful horse spirits would carry them to the next life, but the cold earth turned those horses into haunted or cursed artifacts, forever straining against the frozen soil, their spirits remaining tethered to their masters. The sudden, violent invasion of their rivals simply accelerated a pre-existing spiritual weakness, a lack of adaptation that left them permanently vulnerable to the raw, untamed forces of the unforgiving steppe. The chilling open loop here is the constant archaeological disturbance of the kurgans, which, according to local legend, releases the pent-up, anguished energy of the horsemen's spirits. The foreshadowing is clear. Any civilization that seeks to conquer nature by freezing a moment in time will be judged by the eternal chill. The steppe itself is a giant analogy of a ticking spiritual clock, and the disturbed kurgans are the warning sign that the restless energy of the past is not dead, but merely waiting for the opportunity to ride again. the Punic sacrifice sites, and the dark bargain of Carthage. Carthage, the naval superpower that battled Rome, possessed a deep, chilling curse rooted in its religious practices. The Topets, or sacrifice sites, contain the remains of thousands of infants, offered to placate the dark gods Baal, Hammon and Tanit during times of siege and crisis. The terrifying analogy is that the civilization was literally founded and sustained by a debt of innocent blood, a spiritual contract they believed guaranteed their power, but instead cemented their ultimate violent destruction. This dark spiritual influence was the Achilles heel that Rome ruthlessly exploited. The paradox of the Punic curse is that the greater the threat, the greater the sacrifice, leading to a constant accelerating spiral of self-sabotage. Each infant life was an eerie symbol of desperation, a bargain that only served to draw a greater, hungrier darkness to their shores, rather than repel their enemies. They believed they were buying safety, but they were actually purchasing a guaranteed comprehensive annihilation. The psychological horror of these systematic sacrifices must have pervaded their culture, leaving an enduring stain that weakened the collective soul against any external threat. The final foreshadowing is the complete erasure of the Carthaginian language and records by the Romans, who razed the city and salted the earth. This act of total obliteration was justified by the memory of the Tophets. The curse ensured that the dark forces they courted did not protect them, but instead provided their enemies with the perfect moral pretext for a contrast between silence and revelation. Absolute destruction, followed by a horrifying, quiet justification rooted in the memory of the blood tax. The great Zimbabwe walls and the vanishing gold mines. The immense mortarless stone walls of Great Zimbabwe stand as a mysterious monument to an ancient civilization that possessed vast gold wealth. The curse is rooted in the gold itself, not a blessing, but a source of fatal spiritual influence that turned the people against each other. The recurring motif here is the curse of Midas's touch. The gold was siphoned from the earth in such quantities that it attracted the jealous, destructive gaze of both external raiders and, more powerfully, the internal greed of the ruling elite. The paradox of Great Zimbabwe is the contrast between silence and revelation. The colossal, enduring walls reveal a mastery of architecture, yet they remain profoundly silent about the reasons for the sudden, complete abandonment of the city. The gold mines simply dried up, not from depletion, but almost as if the earth itself sealed them in a final protective act of sovereignty against human avarice. The entire civilization became an analogy of a giant lockbox, expertly constructed to contain wealth, only for the people to suffocate inside due to the spiritual vacuum left by their own material obsession. The final open loop is the enduring mystery of the Great Enclosure, the massive curved wall with no clear defensive purpose. It is widely theorized to be a symbolic spiritual trap or containment zone for the dark energies unleashed by the mining. The immense stone walls are the true haunted or cursed artifacts, still radiating the energy of the gold lust that consumed its builders. The foreshadowing is clear. When a civilization prioritizes the extraction of raw, earthbound wealth over the nurturing of its spiritual life, the earth will eventually withdraw its favor, leaving behind only magnificent, empty monuments to a failed material cult. The Hohokam Canals and the desert's slow revenge. The Hohokam people of the Arizona desert engineered a massive, sophisticated network of irrigation canals that sustained their civilization for over 1,000 years. The curse here is the slow, environmental suicide that came from pushing the land beyond its natural limits. The supernatural influence was not sudden, but a patient, accumulating toxicity. Their incredible ingenuity became their downfall, an analogy for a civilization that loved its technology more than the living earth, resulting in an irreversible self-sabotage of the soil itself. The paradox of the Hohokam canals is that the life-giving water they channeled eventually became the source of their slow, agonizing death. The constant irrigation led to salinization, a build-up of mineral salts that slowly poisoned the fields, rendering the vast, intricate network of waterways futile. This environmental curse was a horrifying foreshadowing of modern ecological collapse, a failure of sustained respect for the delicate balance of the arid landscape. They built a massive machine for life, but the machine had an unchangeable, fatal flaw built into its core logic. the vast empty network of canals remains an eerie symbol across the desert floor, an open loop that poses a persistent question. Did they realize the silent poison building up beneath their feet, or did they simply labor on until the land itself rejected their efforts? These long, straight lines of abandoned earth are the haunted or cursed artifacts of their final doomed efforts, a testament to a civilization that was not conquered by a rival, but silently and completely defeated by the slow, inevitable and righteous revenge of the desert soil they tried too hard to control. The Nuraghi Towers of Sardinia and the Guardian's Eternal Watch. The island of Sardinia is dotted with thousands of massive, conical stone towers known as nuraghe, built by a lost civilization obsessed with defense and secrecy. The curse is rooted in their extreme isolation and constant vigilance, creating a spiritual influence of relentless, exhausting paranoia. The recurring motif is one of absolute self-containment, a civilization that built too many fortresses, sealing itself off from the very trade and cultural exchange that might have saved it from internal decay. They were not invaded, they simply suffocated in their own anxiety. The paradox of the nuraghe is that the towers, intended as symbols of absolute power and protection, actually became the silent executioners of their culture. Each one is a magnificent haunted or cursed artifact, the entirety of its stone imbued with the spiritual weight of its lonely, perpetually anxious inhabitants. The sheer, non-stop effort required to staff and maintain thousands of these defensive structures must have drained the civilization of its resources, creating a profound, irreversible cultural and economic exhaustion that was far more destructive than any foreign army. The great contrast between silence and revelation is that the towers remain nearly intact, monuments of solid stone that refuse to fall, yet they reveal nothing about the people who built them. This open loop leaves us with the foreshadowing that the greatest danger to a civilization is not the attack from without, but the paralyzing fear within. The nuraghe stand today as eerie symbols of a people who successfully defended themselves into oblivion, building a magnificent, impenetrable cage only to forget how to live within it. Rome's secret pits and the curse of the Devotio Imperial. Rome's final curse was not a barbaric invasion, but the spiritual self-sabotage rooted in its deepest military traditions, particularly the ancient rite of Devotio. This was the ritual where a commander would sacrifice his own life, and, often, his enemy's entire army, to the chthonic gods of the underworld, effectively trading his soul for victory. The analogy here is that the entire empire was founded upon a spiritual credit card, continually buying its triumphs with the increasing debt of its own collective soul, a dark, self-inflicted spiritual influence that slowly metastasized. The terrifying paradox is that the more Rome won, the deeper the curse became. Every victory bought with Devotio added another layer of infernal obligation, drawing the attention of darker, hungrier forces to the empire's core. The secret pits and hidden shrines found beneath the Forum were eerie symbols of these desperate pacts, places where the shadowed eyes of the underworld were actively courted. The curse ensured that the empire's final collapse was not just political, but a spiritual foreclosure, the ultimate payment demanded for centuries of borrowed bloody power. The final, devastating foreshadowing is that the Roman Empire did not fade away. It violently shattered, consumed by internal strife and existential terror. The recurring motif of Devotio is the chilling open loop that proves Rome was not a victim of history, but the architect of its own spiritual demise. The very foundations of the empire were haunted or cursed artifacts, soaked in the blood of self-sacrifice, guaranteeing that the greatest engine of power the world had ever seen was spiritually programmed for a spectacular, comprehensive self-annihilation from its very beginning. The Library of Alexandria and the burning of knowledge. The destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria, regardless of the exact historical timing, carries a potent curse, the self-inflicted wound of choosing ignorance over the absolute preservation of knowledge. The curse is rooted in the spiritual arrogance of the ruling classes who deemed certain texts dangerous or unnecessary. The analogy is that the civilization was not invaded by barbarians seeking to destroy their books, but internally defeated by its own fear of a complete, uncomfortable, and challenging truth. The paradox of the library's loss is that the civilization which most valued knowledge was the one that ultimately allowed it to be scattered and consumed by flames. The fire, whether literal or metaphorical, became the ultimate eerie symbol of this self-sabotage, demonstrating a spiritual influence that prioritized political stability over absolute enlightenment. The library's fate is a terrifying foreshadowing. It proves that a society can be at its intellectual zenith and still be one small act of political convenience away from a total, irreversible cultural lobotomy. The open loop of the Library of Alexandria is the eternal nagging question of the lost knowledge, the forbidden, terrifying truth that vanished into the silence. It is believed that the missing texts contained information that would have fundamentally altered the course of human development, including secrets about the very nature of existence. The memory of the library is a haunted or cursed artifact, the ghost of a potential future that was sacrificed by the hands of its own heirs, and the vacuum of its absence continues to draw the darkness into our world. Constantinople's hidden tunnels and the last emperor's oath. The final curse of the Byzantine Empire lies not in the Ottoman siege, but in the forgotten hidden tunnels beneath Constantinople, sealed in the moments before the city's final collapse. These tunnels are the eerie symbols of a desperate spiritual influence, built in the vain hope that the Emperor Constantinus XIX might one day return to reclaim his seat. The curse is rooted in the last emperor's oath, a desperate, powerful spiritual covenant that guaranteed his spectral return, binding his soul eternally to the sacred geography of the city he failed to save. The paradox of the emperor's oath is that his magnificent devotion to the city became the very haunted or cursed artifact that prevented its spiritual peace. His soul is eternally locked in an open loop, forever patrolling the silent, sealed darkness beneath the golden capital. The oath ensured that even in ruin the city could never belong to its conquerors, but it also cursed the emperor to a perpetual state of watchful, agonizing failure, unable to cross the threshold into true rest. The chilling foreshadowing is the contrast between silence and revelation. The city's outward transformation into Istanbul reveals the triumph of a new empire, but the absolute silence of the sealed tunnels beneath reveals the secret, internal power struggle still being waged by the emperor's ghost. The belief persists that, when a rightful Christian emperor finally rides through the Golden Gate, the stone-sealed emperor will rise from the earth to reclaim his throne. This is the recurring motif of the undying ruler, a tragic figure eternally bound by his final, desperate promise. The Inca mummies and the silence of the mountain gods. The Inca civilization was ruled by its dead. The preserved, revered mummies of its emperors, Maliki, were central to its political and spiritual life. The curse is rooted in this extreme ancestral worship, creating a collective dependence on the deceased for guidance, turning the living into mere executors of the spectral elite's will. The supernatural influence was the very act of cold, perfect preservation, which prevented the dead from truly passing on, binding their shadowed eyes and their spiritual demands eternally to the fortunes of the living empire. The terrifying paradox is that the preservation of the dead was the key to the empire's power, but also the structural weakness that guaranteed its collapse. When the Spanish arrived, the seizure and desecration of the Malki did not just wound the empire politically, it severed the spiritual lifeline of the entire culture. The abrupt removal of the ghostly elite created an open loop of cultural psychosis, causing the living to lose all faith and direction, leading to a profound, paralyzing spiritual confusion that hastened the conquest. The recurring motif here is the haunted or cursed artifacts of the high-altitude mummies, often found in a state of unnatural preservation, their silent forms embodying the cost of spiritual entanglement. The final, chilling foreshadowing is that the mountains themselves, the Apus or gods, grew silent in the face of the desecration, a terrifying contrast between silence and revelation. Their silence revealed the terrible truth. The gods of the mountain would allow their dependent worshippers to perish if the living could not protect the sanctity of the preserved ancestors. Babylon's ziggurat and the confusion of tongues. The most famous architectural project of ancient Babylon, the legendary Tower of Babel, carries a curse rooted in the sin of collective, overreaching ambition. The ziggurat, a massive tiered structure intended to pierce the heavens, was not simply a temple, but an eerie symbol of a spiritual challenge to the divine. The curse, as described in myth, was a direct, targeted supernatural influence, the confusion of tongues, which did not kill the people, but paralyzed them with mutual misunderstanding, causing the great work to stall and the cohesive civilization to fracture. The paradox of the Babylonian ziggurat is that the pursuit of a singular collective ambition resulted in the permanent chaotic division of humanity. The tower itself is the ultimate haunted or cursed artifact, the enormous ruined foundation remaining as an analogy of a terrifying truth. Any human effort to achieve perfect unity and knowledge without divine consent will be met with a calculated spiritual sabotage that guarantees permanent disunity. The entire structure is a testament to the fact that the greatest empires are often undone by a simple but profound lack of communication. The chilling foreshadowing is that the ruins of the massive structure represent the eternal recurring motif of human fragmentation, an open loop where the descendants of Babel continue to struggle against the linguistic and cultural chaos imposed by the divine judgment. The greatest terror of the ziggurat is the contrast between silence and revelation. Its massive silent foundation reveals the immense potential of a unified world, but its abandonment reveals the devastating ease with which that potential can be shattered into endless, bickering pieces. The Viking settlement of Greenland and the stubborn ice. The Viking colonies in Greenland did not vanish due to native aggression or disease, but from a profound curse of inflexibility, a stubborn, self-destructive refusal to adapt to the changing climate. This environmental curse was a subtle, persistent supernatural influence that acted through the relentless cooling of the Little Ice Age. The Norse settlers, clinging fiercely to their European traditions of cattle farming and wool clothing, ignored the superior hunting and survival wisdom of the Inuit. Their cultural arrogance was an analogy of a locked spiritual door, leading them to starve surrounded by abundant yet culturally forbidden food sources. The paradox of the Greenland Norse is that their strong cultural identity, the very foundation of their pride, became the cage of their doom. The settlements became haunted or cursed artifacts, silent ruins standing today as witnesses to a self-inflicted spiritual siege. They chose cultural purity over survival, unable to transition from farming to marine hunting, and died staring out at the frozen fjords full of seals they refused to eat. The ice, a recurring motif of indifferent nature, was the quiet executioner, sealing their fate not with a dramatic storm, but with a gradual, suffocating chill that lasted centuries. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the eerie archaeological evidence of their last desperate moments. Skeletons show clear signs of malnutrition, yet the surrounding seas were teeming with life. This open loop leaves us with a terrifying foreshadowing. A civilization can possess all the tools for survival, but if its spiritual pride makes it resistant to necessary change, the most powerful curse is the one that compels it to follow a doomed path. The stubborn ice remains, a shadowed eye watching all who refuse to bend, the Ethelred's gold and the weight of the Danegeld. The curse of Anglo-Saxon England under King Ethelred the Unready lies in the profound spiritual infection caused by the Danegeld, the massive payments of gold made to Viking raiders to ensure peace. This gold, paid in shame and terror, was not a tribute but a psychic poison. The curse is rooted in the analogy of trading moral integrity for temporary safety, a dark bargain that proved to be a self-sabotage of the national soul. Each coin paid was an eerie symbol of cowardice, creating a spiritual influence that invited further, more aggressive predation by the enemy. The terrifying paradox of the Danegeld is that the more gold the English paid, the more persistent and hungry the Vikings became. The precious metal, meant to buy peace, became the catalyst for endless war, transforming the gold itself into a haunted or cursed artifact of national disgrace. The vast sums of gold secretly raised and paid created an immense, paralyzing spiritual vacuum across the land. The moral and psychological toll of constantly admitting defeat and funding one's own oppressors fractured the national will long before the final military defeat occurred. The final foreshadowing is that the gold coins paid as Danegeld did not disappear. They were later recovered in Viking hordes across Scandinavia, silent contrasts between silence and revelation of the massive national shame. This open loop serves as a stark warning. a civilization that attempts to solve a spiritual or military problem with purely material wealth will only accelerate its own demise. The true cost of the gold was the dissolution of the collective spirit, leaving the kingdom spiritually bankrupt and ripe for total conquest. The Parthian cataphracts and the unseen arrows. The Parthian Empire, Rome's greatest nemesis, possessed a tactical curse rooted in its use of the cataphracts, heavily armoured cavalry that were virtually impenetrable. The paradox is that this absolute defence created an unsustainable spiritual and material inflexibility. Their reliance on the cataphracts as an invincible eerie symbol of power fostered a collective arrogance, ignoring the need for lighter, more adaptive forces, a self-sabotage that cost them dearly when facing fast-moving, unconventional enemies who refused to meet them in a straight fight. The true curse manifested in the unseen arrows of their downfall, the slow, spiritual decay that came from believing in absolute invincibility. The reliance on armour and overwhelming force blinded them to more subtle threats, a supernatural influence acting through their own overconfidence. Their eventual defeat was less military and more psychological. When the invincible finally did bleed, the shock shattered the national confidence, revealing the horrifying truth that the metal shell protected the body, but exposed the spiritual core to catastrophic failure. The recurring motif of the Parthian shot, the desperate, powerful arrow loosed while in tactical retreat, is the final contrast between silence and revelation. It reveals a profound, agonizing spiritual influence. They were masters of the powerful parting blow, yet incapable of sustaining a standing defense. The ruins of the Parthian cities, largely ignored by archaeologists, remain an open loop, a silent foreshadowing that the most spectacular displays of military might are often the clearest invitations for an adversary to seek out the one true, fatal chink in the spiritual armour, the Nabatean tombs of Petra and the locksmith's secret. The Nabateans, the master builders of the rock-cut city of Petra, etched their curse into the very stone of their magnificent tombs. These elaborate monuments were sealed with impossible ingenuity, not just against robbers, but with powerful spiritual locks, making them haunted or cursed artifacts that resisted intrusion. The curse is rooted in their spiritual focus on protecting their dead from disturbance, a self-sabotage that led them to expend vast resources on ensuring the eternal security of the underworld, neglecting the transient world of the living. The chilling paradox is that by making their tombs utterly impregnable, they trapped the spiritual influence of their ancestors within the rock, binding their ghosts to the city's fortunes. The secrets of the locksmith, the unique clever mechanisms used to seal the chamber, are an analogy for the cultural rigidity that finally doomed them. When trade routes shifted and seismic activity threatened the city, their obsession with locking down the past prevented the collective will from adapting to the living, necessary changes of the present. The open loop of the Nabatean curse is the terrifying contrast between silence and revelation. The city's perfect, silent preservation in the rock reveals their mastery of stone, but the absolute sudden abandonment reveals their total inability to master fate. The foreshadowing is stark. A civilization that focuses all its genius on locking down its spiritual debt and ensuring the comfort of its dead will find that the earth eventually loses patience, throwing open the entire spiritual system to chaos, leaving only the magnificent empty facades behind. The Phoenician sea maps and the routes that vanished. The Phoenician civilization, the masters of the ancient seas, carried a unique curse rooted in their absolute mastery of navigation and their relentless secrecy. Their wealth was built on forbidden knowledge, precise, powerful sea maps that charted secret routes and trade winds. The curse is rooted in their spiritual arrogance, their belief that they could permanently monopolize the knowledge of the waves, creating an unsustainable paradox where the very source of their power was so closely guarded that its loss guaranteed their total disappearance. The most terrifying supernatural influence was the deliberate self-inflicted erasure of their knowledge upon their defeat by Rome. The Phoenicians chose to sink their maps and burn their logs rather than let their secrets fall into the hands of their enemies. This act of spiritual self-sabotage turned their ocean-going wisdom into an eerie symbol of absolute loss, ensuring that their vast global network could never be rebuilt, not even by their own descendants. The ocean itself became their co-conspirator and their final resting place. The open loop of the Phoenician curse is the unrecoverable knowledge of the sea, the ghostly routes and forgotten navigation techniques that could have led to greater geographical discoveries. The disappearance of their maps is a final, chilling contrast between silence and revelation, leaving a profound strategic vacuum in the maritime history of the ancient world. This foreshadowing is clear. Any civilization that builds its power on the monopoly of secrets, refusing to share or adapt its core wisdom, is spiritually programmed for a sudden, absolute, and total annihilation. The Kushite pyramids of Meroe and the Egyptian echo. The Kushite kingdom of Meroe, built on the foundations of its Egyptian neighbours, carried the devastating curse of second-hand glory. Their massive, unique pyramids, smaller, steeper, and more numerous than those of Egypt, are an analogy of a civilization spiritually paralysed by the shadow of its predecessor. The curse is rooted in the supernatural influence of imitation, a failure to forge a truly unique spiritual identity, which resulted in a culture constantly looking backward, draining its vitality into the monumental recreation of a borrowed past. The paradox of the Meroitic pyramids is that in striving for an eternal connection to the powerful Egyptian deities, they created only a localized spiritual vacuum. These structures are haunted or cursed artifacts not of their own design, but by the overwhelming, invisible weight of the Egyptian spiritual legacy. This obsession with the past prevented the necessary social and technological evolution needed to confront their own unique challenges, leading to a profound self-sabotage where imitation became a spiritual disease. The final foreshadowing is the eventual collapse of Meroe due to environmental and economic pressures, a failure that came not from a massive single invasion, but from a slow, spiritual hemorrhage caused by constant comparison. The contrast between silence and revelation in the hundreds of small, crumbling pyramids reveals the final, terrifying truth. A culture that copies its past masters instead of creating its own future is spiritually guaranteed to be a mere echo, condemned to repeat the flaws of the original without ever achieving its true genius. The Nazari Gardens of the Alhambra and the Water's Memory. The exquisite Nazari Gardens of the Alhambra in Granada, built by the last Islamic rulers in Spain, hold a subtle, profound curse rooted in the emotional and spiritual intensity of their creation. The gardens, with their intricate, life-giving water systems, are an analogy of a fragile paradise built on the edge of a spiritual abyss. The curse is rooted in the paradox of beauty over life. In attempting to create a perfect, eternal heaven on earth, they poured the entirety of their doomed civilization's collective spiritual will into the ephemeral beauty of the water, neglecting the necessary defenses of their physical kingdom. The most terrifying supernatural influence lies in the water's memory, the belief that the water flowing through the gardens retains the final, agonizing spiritual influence and sadness of the exiled rulers who created them. The gardens are haunted or cursed artifacts, their beauty imbued with the deep melancholy of inevitable loss. Every fountain and flowing channel is an eerie symbol of tears and spiritual longing, a deliberate self-sabotage that ensured their final surrender was more a poetic, heartbroken resignation than a bloody military defeat. The open loop of the Nazari Gardens is the persistence of this spiritual influence, the profound, sad beauty that hangs over the site, acting as a final contrast between silence and revelation. The silence of the abandoned halls reveals the spiritual toll of their defeat, while the ever-flowing water reveals the eternal, mournful voice of the curse. This is a chilling foreshadowing, a civilization that sacrifices its strategic strength for a final, magnificent poetic statement of beauty is spiritually choosing to go out in a blaze of glory, embracing its own beautiful, tragic end. The kingdom of Aksum and the theft of the Ark. The kingdom of Aksum, centered in modern-day Ethiopia, built its spiritual power on the belief that it housed the ultimate haunted or cursed artifact, the Ark of the Covenant. The curse is rooted in the very act of its possession, a spiritual influence so overwhelming and potent that it demanded total, unsustainable cultural servitude. The Aksumites became prisoners of their relic, forced into an extreme piety that prioritized the absolute sanctity and secrecy of the Ark over the necessary adaptation and expansion of their secular empire. The terrifying paradox is that the immense spiritual power of the Ark eventually resulted in the Empire's material and military collapse. Their total reliance on the relic as an invincible eerie symbol of divine protection blinded them to the gradual material threats posed by regional rivals. The curse ensured a devastating, self-inflicted spiritual siege, where the entire civilization became locked into an open loop of ritualistic maintenance for an object that could not be used, but also could not be ignored. The recurring motif of the shadowed eyes watching the relic symbolizes the ever-present, terrifying, spiritual influence that keeps the Ark locked away in a single chapel. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the Empire's slow, quiet withdrawal into the Ethiopian highlands, a spiritual self-sabotage that saw them abandoning their coasts and their power to protect the relic. This foreshadowing is absolute. A civilization that bases its entire existence on possessing an object of ultimate, uncontrollable spiritual power is spiritually signing a contract for total isolation and eventual decline. The Terracotta Army and the Emperor's Soul traps. The curse of the Terracotta Army is the horrifying spiritual influence of its creator, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. The 8,000 unique clay soldiers were not merely grave goods, but were intended as soul traps, permanent vessels to house the spirits of the emperor's actual army and retain their fighting strength for his afterlife. The curse is rooted in this massive supernatural act of servitude, where the souls of thousands were violently stripped from their natural rest and bound to the emperor's spiritual ambition, ensuring his immortal power at their eternal expense. The terrifying paradox is that the emperor's quest for eternal life through this spiritual act of self-sabotage resulted in the rapid, chaotic collapse of his dynasty immediately following his death. The dark energy required to bind the vast army of souls created an immense open loop of spiritual chaos that violently destabilized the entire political structure. The clay soldiers, now haunted or cursed artifacts, silently radiate the collective, anguished resentment of the trapped spirits, a spiritual rebellion that successfully destabilized the empire from beyond the grave. The final contrast between silence and revelation is that the army stands in perfect silent formation, yet their thousands of individually unique faces reveal the horrific personal spiritual theft of each soul. This foreshadowing is clear. Any civilization whose ruling class attempts to achieve physical or spiritual immortality through the forceful, massive subjugation of its people will be consumed by the recurring motif of collective vengeful chaos. The Terracotta Army is a silent monument to a spectacular self-inflicted spiritual defeat, the Sarmatian horse bones and the ritual of no return. The Sarmatians, fierce nomadic warriors of the steppes, practiced a disturbing rite where their horses were deliberately and ritually slain and buried to accompany their masters. The curse of this civilization is the spiritual self-sabotage of the ritual of no return. This act, repeated countless times, was an analogy of a collective commitment to a one-way existence, ensuring that their civilization lacked the spiritual flexibility to ever settle down or adapt to changing political landscapes. They ritually guaranteed their own eternal nomadism and eventual extinction. The profound paradox of the Sarmatian horse burial is that the act intended to secure their future in the afterlife actually drained the living of their most vital resource, their magnificent steeds. This spiritual influence created an immense, unsustainable material debt. The mass graves, filled with the sacrificed bones of their horses, are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, silently testifying to a culture that preferred the absolute certainty of the spiritual journey over the messy, uncertain reality of living survival. The recurring motif of the vanishing warrior is the final foreshadowing. The Sarmatians did not end in a single battle, but simply faded into the silence of history, consumed by the relentless nomadism they ritually guaranteed. The bones remain in the earth, an open loop proving that their civilization's end was a deliberate spiritual choice made over centuries. They chose the eerie symbol of the sacrificed horse to ensure their freedom from attachment, achieving a complete, tragic and permanent spiritual dissolution. The Puebloan great houses and the Great Silence. The massive, spectacular great houses of the ancient Puebloan people, like those found in Chaco Canyon, are magnificent architectural achievements that were mysteriously and abruptly abandoned. The curse is rooted in the overwhelming spiritual influence of their own complexity. a self-sabotage that saw the civilization prioritize ritualistic building and astronomical alignment over ecological sustainability. The houses are an analogy of a civilization climbing too high on its own ritual, believing that perfect geometry and alignment could ward off the inevitable climate curse that was quietly drying up their world. The terrifying paradox is that the ceremonial perfection of the great houses was inversely proportional to the civilization's chance of survival. Each massive stone structure is a haunted or cursed artifact, imbued with the intense collective spiritual energy of a people desperately trying to force the heavens to yield rain. The sheer, non-stop effort to quarry stone and build these monumental structures drained the civilization of the manpower and ingenuity needed to adapt to the mounting environmental collapse, ensuring their spiritual obsession ultimately consumed their material future. The ultimate contrast between silence and revelation is the complete and utter quiet that pervades the ruins, a silence so profound it is known as the Great Silence. This open loop leaves us with the foreshadowing that a civilization can be undone not by an outside enemy, but by the relentless, internal pressure of its own spiritual demands. The meticulously aligned doors and windows, now empty and staring at the vast, desolate sky, are the shadowed eyes of a culture that died because the heavens simply refused to answer their perfect, silent prayers. The Moundville Artifacts and the Vengeful Earth. The vast, ceremonial mounds of Moundville, Alabama, conceal a powerful curse rooted in the ritualistic art of the Mississippian culture that occupied it. The intricate shell engravings and pottery feature a recurring motif of underworld entities, human sacrifice, and perpetual warfare. The curse is the result of the Mississippians deliberately courting the most violent and unstable spiritual influence, the dark, chthonic forces associated with death and the sub-earth, in an attempt to justify their elite-driven militaristic society. The paradox lies in the fact that the spiritual power they harnessed to achieve political dominance was a form of self-sabotage that ensured their violent end. The beautifully crafted artifacts are eerie symbols of their obsession with ritualized aggression, becoming haunted or cursed artifacts that quietly poisoned the collective spirit. Their entire existence became an analogy of a continuous, elaborate ritual of self-destruction, driven by the belief that life and power could only be sustained by a constant bloody exchange with the vengeful earth spirits they so relentlessly invoked. The final contrast between silence and revelation is that the mounds remain massive and silent, yet the ceremonial earth beneath them is saturated with the dark energy of human sacrifice and ritualized violence. The eventual collapse of Moundville was not a peaceful transition, but a profound, violent fragmentation, the consequence of the chthonic forces they welcomed finally demanding a total payment. The earth itself rose up to reject them, turning their civilization into an open loop of violence that faded into the great silence of the American South. The Kingdom of Funan and the Serpent's Price. The Kingdom of Funan, an early powerful Southeast Asian state, built its foundation on the myth of a union between a powerful Brahmin and a serpent princess, Naga. The curse is rooted in this spiritual bargain. The founding myth itself is an eerie symbol of a spiritual influence that bound the civilization's destiny to the chaotic, often destructive power of the water and the serpent spirits. The paradox is that their success was contingent on the favour of a deeply unpredictable and potentially malevolent entity, the immense Naga, ruler of the floods and the deep. This sacred bargain was a form of self-sabotage, an analogy of a civilization that built its house on the water's edge, knowing the foundation was fundamentally unstable. The Naga's favour required constant, elaborate ritual placation, a spiritual debt that drained the state's resources and fostered a collective paranoia about the potential for sudden, catastrophic flooding. The immense rice cultivation that sustained their power was perpetually threatened by the very supernatural influence that supposedly protected them, a spiritual tightrope walk that could not be maintained indefinitely. The inevitable end came not through conquest, but through the overwhelming, slow, silent failure of their water-dependent systems, which led to a spiritual and ecological collapse that allowed a successor state to quietly absorb them. The Funanese curse is a chilling foreshadowing. It proves that a civilization built upon a spiritual bargain with a chaotic, elemental force is ultimately condemned to be destroyed by that same element. The forgotten ruins remain an open loop. a silent warning that the price of the serpent's protection is the certainty of its eventual crushing indifference. The Great Khan's tomb and the river's betrayal. The final resting place of Genghis Khan is perhaps the greatest open loop in history, a secret fiercely protected by a curse of absolute erasure. The spiritual influence of the Great Khan's will was so overwhelming that his death required an act of colossal self-sabotage, the ritualized mass murder of all who attended his funeral, ensuring that no living soul could betray the location. The curse is rooted in this profound, intentional violence, which created an immense, silent spiritual debt across the entire Mongol Empire. The most terrifying contrast between silence and revelation is the pervasive, unsettling quiet that surrounds the historical search for the tomb. Legend states that a river was temporarily diverted over the burial site, making the flowing water the ultimate spiritual guard. The river's betrayal of its own natural course for this dark purpose turned the water into a powerful supernatural influence, eternally flowing over the haunted or cursed artifact of the tomb, preventing its disturbance and sealing the secret with a constant cold pressure. The recurring motif of the murdered witnesses and the diverted river ensured that the Khan's power, though absolute in life, became an absolute vacuum in death, destabilizing the entire empire. This foreshadowing is clear. Any power that seeks to achieve ultimate security through absolute violence and self-erasure will leave behind a spiritual scar so immense that it guarantees the rapid fragmentation of the power it sought to preserve. The missing tomb is an analogy for the Mongol Empire itself, a magnificent, terrifying force that vanished into thin air. The Mochi sacrificial murals and the debt to the waves. The Mochi civilization of ancient Peru left behind elaborate, shocking murals depicting massive human sacrifices, often in combat or ritual execution. The curse is rooted in their extreme, escalating spiritual servitude to the gods of the waves and the sky. The recurring motif of bloodletting and ritual combat reveals a civilization caught in a horrifying paradox. They believed that the greater the sacrifice, the more they could avert the environmental disasters of El Niño, when the ocean turns against the land. The terrifying supernatural influence of this curse was the escalation of the blood debt. As El Niño events grew more severe, the Moche priests were compelled to increase the ritual violence, leading to a spiritual self-sabotage where the civilization literally consumed its own populace to placate an increasingly hungry, chaotic ocean. The murals are eerie symbols and haunted or cursed artifacts that quietly testify to a culture that found itself trapped in a one-way spiritual contract that demanded absolute unsustainable payment in human life, guaranteeing their internal collapse. The foreshadowing is evident in the final years when the Mochi people abandoned their centres, having realised the gods of the waves were indifferent to their terror. The contrast between silence and revelation is the stark, empty quiet of the abandoned coastal centres, revealing the final, terrifying truth. The gods of the ocean did not want their devotion. They merely wanted the complete dissolution of the civilization that dared to build its power so precariously close to the shifting, chaotic violence of the waves, their screams silenced by the desert wind. The Chimu city of Chan Chan and the clay's fragility. The Chimu Empire's capital, Chan Chan, was the largest adobe city in the ancient world, a magnificent, sprawling urban centre built entirely of clay. The curse is rooted in the very material of its foundation, the extreme spiritual arrogance of a civilization that built its eternal capital out of inherently fragile, ephemeral clay. The entire city is an analogy of a civilization that believed its wealth and power could override the fundamental laws of nature, a self-sabotage that was doomed by the first great storm. The paradox of Chan Chan is that its massive size and elaborate decorative walls, designed to convey wealth, ensured its total destruction. The clay, intended as an eerie symbol of their abundance, was the silent internal supernatural influence that guaranteed their collapse. When the inevitable intense rains of an extreme El Niño arrived, the entire massive city dissolved into mud, erasing their magnificent wealth in a matter of weeks. They built a massive monument to impermanence, guaranteed to melt away at the first significant challenge. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the current state of the massive eroding ruins, which reveal the horrific vulnerability of the clay structure. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that pours its entire spiritual and material resource into a single, magnificent, yet structurally flawed monument is spiritually programmed for a sudden, total, and irreversible annihilation. The slow, relentless decay of the adobe is the open loop of their curse, proving that the silent, patient rain is often a far more formidable foe than any human army. The city of Cahokia and the ghost of the great chief Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, vanished with a terrifying speed and finality, leaving behind massive earth mounds. The curse is rooted in the immense spiritual influence and self-aggrandizement of its ruling class, particularly the powerful great chief whose authority was absolute. The entire civilization was an analogy of a giant social pyramid, so structurally dependent on the life and power of its singular leader that his inevitable passing created an irreparable spiritual and political vacuum. The most chilling paradox is the massive monk's mound, the largest earthwork, which symbolizes the civilization's staggering capacity for collective labor. This monumental effort was a form of self-sabotage, draining the collective energy into the elevation of a singular figure, turning the entire city into a haunted or cursed artifact dedicated to one man's ego. The entire spiritual and economic system collapsed because the power was never distributed, ensuring the system was structurally programmed to fail the moment the central, irreplaceable figure vanished. The open loop of Cahokia is the profound, sudden silence that followed its abandonment, a final contrast between silence and revelation. The empty fields where once stood thousands of homes reveal a catastrophic, instantaneous spiritual fragmentation. The foreshadowing is clear. Any society that sacrifices its decentralized strength for the absolute, unsustainable power of one single figure is spiritually committing suicide. The ghost of the great chief and the immense lonely mound he commanded remain the recurring motif of a power that simply vanished with the passing of its single vessel. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi and the alien truth. The curse of the Gnostic texts, secretly buried in jars near Nag Hammadi, is rooted in the forbidden knowledge they contain, a profound spiritual self-sabotage that terrified the established religious authorities. The texts offer a terrifying revelation of the human condition, that the world itself is a prison, created by a malevolent, ignorant lesser god. This spiritual influence was deemed so toxic and destabilizing that it was condemned to be wiped from history, forcing its followers to seal the texts and their frightening truth beneath the desert sand. The terrifying paradox is that the Gnostics sought ultimate spiritual liberation through perfect knowledge, but the truth they found, that they were trapped by a cruel demiurge, led to their spiritual, political, and material destruction. The jars of scrolls are haunted or cursed artifacts, imbued with the intense fear of the absolute alien truth they held. The act of burying them was not a mere precaution, but a spiritual acceptance of their inevitable fate, a withdrawal from a corrupt world they could not save. The open loop of the Gnostic curse is the sheer difficulty of integrating their core, horrifying truth into mainstream thought. The belief that the true God is utterly alien and unconcerned with human suffering. This foreshadowing is persistent. Any civilization that dares to look too closely at the nature of its own creation will find a terrifying, cold indifference at the core of existence, a truth that guarantees a profound, crippling existential paralysis and spiritual self-sabotage. The texts remain an eerie symbol of knowledge that is too dangerous to share. The Zapotec tomb of Zaachila and the final sleep. The Zapotec civilization's curse is focused on the magnificent royal tomb of Zaachila, which revealed the cultural practice of leaving the royal dead in an eternal state of vigil. The curse is rooted in the extreme ancestor worship that demanded the living dedicate vast resources and spiritual energy to the absolute perfect stasis of the deceased royal line. This was a form of spiritual self-sabotage, binding the entire political structure to the perpetual spiritual influence of the silent, unmoving royal Malki. The terrifying paradox is that in ensuring the perpetual spiritual presence of their rulers, the Zapotec people inadvertently stunted their own spiritual and social evolution. The tomb is an analogy of a civilization's rigid reliance on the past, preventing the necessary adaptation to external threats and internal change. The royal remains are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, their quiet, perfectly arrayed presence guaranteeing that the living could never truly break free from the traditional dictates of the long dead, an open loop of spiritual servitude. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the profound quiet of the burial chamber, which reveals the civilization's complete spiritual paralysis. This foreshadowing is clear. A society that looks only backward for wisdom, prioritizing the needs of the dead over the living, is spiritually programmed for a slow, agonizing decline, until a more dynamic, forward-looking culture absorbs it entirely. The recurring motif of the quiet, unmoving royal bodies is the final tragic statement of a civilization that simply chose to follow its masters into the silent sleep of history. The Indus script and the self-erasure of memory. Returning to the Indus Valley civilization, the curse of its undeciphered, script is the final agonizing spiritual influence that seals its fate. The sheer existence of a lost, unreadable language is an eerie symbol of a civilization that completed a magnificent collective act of self-erasure. The curse is rooted in the belief that whatever catastrophe ended their era was so horrifying that the survivors collectively decided to abandon their written legacy, ensuring the cause of their end could never be known or repeated. The terrifying paradox is that the absence of knowledge is itself a profound form of knowledge. The silence speaks louder than any written record. The seals are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, small pieces of stone imbued with the spiritual weight of a truth too toxic to survive. This profound self-sabotage created an ultimate open loop in history, a deliberate permanent void that ensures we can never truly learn the final, horrifying secret of their collapse, only stare into the vast empty space where their wisdom once resided. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the deep, unnerving quiet of their abandoned cities, which reveals the completion of their spiritual goal, absolute forgetfulness. This foreshadowing is clear. The most profound curse a civilization can enact upon itself is the willful annihilation of its own memory, ensuring its downfall is utterly complete and unlearnable by its successors. The recurring motif of the unreadable glyphs is the final permanent warning that some secrets are so dangerous that total silence is the only remaining form of spiritual defense. The Antikythera mechanism and the forbidden algorithm. You stare at the corroded, impossibly complex gears of the Antikythera mechanism and realize the curse is one of forbidden knowledge, a self-sabotage that saw an advanced, ancient understanding of the cosmos violently erased from history. This device, built centuries before its time, is a terrifying haunted or cursed artifact, its complexity suggesting a level of spiritual influence and scientific insight the Greco-Roman world was not ready to possess. The mechanism's sudden loss in a shipwreck was not a random accident, but a spiritual act of erasure, a deliberate severing of the intellectual thread by the forces of history that deemed such advanced knowledge too dangerous for humanity. The paradox of this device is that its genius was its doom. It stood as an analogy of a civilization's capacity for creation that far outstripped its capacity for preservation. Its sophistication, far from inspiring further innovation, likely terrified the prevailing philosophical and spiritual order, which preferred a simple, earth-centered cosmos. The mechanism's technology became an eerie symbol of hubris, a self-inflicted wound where the knowledge itself was perceived as a dark, destabilizing force, guaranteeing its violent removal and subsequent cultural amnesia for nearly 2 millennia. The chilling open loop is the silence of the other similar, devices that must have existed, creating a profound, unfillable void in the history of science. The foreshadowing is that great leaps in understanding are always susceptible to being drowned by the prevailing mediocrity of the time. The final contrast between silence and revelation is that the mechanical fragments, recovered from the deep, remain a silent, persistent accusation. The ghost of an algorithm that proves our own history is filled with lost futures we were too spiritually terrified to preserve. The Viking berserkers and the Fury's price. The Viking berserkers embodied a terrifying curse of self-induced spiritual mania, the deliberate summoning of an uncontrollable non-human fury. the ritual consumption of hallucinogens, or the deep meditative channeling of a dark spiritual influence allowed them to transcend fear and pain, transforming them from men into something primal and unstoppable. The curse is rooted in this self-sabotage. They willingly traded their human souls for temporary devastating martial power, becoming haunted, or cursed, artifacts of pure, chaotic aggression that terrified both friend and foe alike. The paradox of the Berserkers is that their terrifying strength was the guarantee of their eventual ruin. Their profound, self-inflicted separation from human reason and fear created an analogy of a burning fuse, a spiritual weapon designed only for destruction, incapable of forming a sustainable social structure. The terrifying recurring motif of the wild, foaming warrior who could not be controlled ensured that their communities, while benefiting from their power, could never truly integrate them, relegating them to the fringes and guaranteeing their eventual exhaustion and isolation. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the abrupt disappearance of the Berserker tradition from the historical record, a sudden silence that suggests a massive collective spiritual rejection of the practice. The foreshadowing is chilling. A society that embraces controlled, chaotic violence as its highest spiritual expression will ultimately find the chaos turning inward. The spiritual debt incurred by the self-possession was simply too high, guaranteeing a total, self-inflicted dissolution that left behind only the legend of the Fury's price. Easter Island's Moai and the Curse of the Silent Audience. Easter Island's famous Moai statues are the centerpiece of a devastating curse rooted in hubris and spiritual competition. The people of Rapa Nui became consumed by a spiritual influence that demanded the creation of ever larger, more elaborate statues, believing that these massive silent figures would guarantee the favour of their ancestors. The terrifying paradox is that this collective obsession led to an absolute self-sabotage, as the resources needed to carve and transport the massive heads resulted in the wholesale destruction of the island's forests. The curse ensured that the act of creating these eerie symbols of ancestral power was the very mechanism of the civilization's ecological collapse. The entire island became an analogy of a spiritual treadmill. The more they carved, the more power they believed they possessed, but the closer they came to starvation and total environmental ruin. The massive, silent faces became haunted or cursed artifacts, staring blankly at the sea, embodying the spiritual arrogance of a people who chose monumental art over the necessary practical wisdom of sustainability. The final terrifying contrast between silence and revelation is the image of the toppled Moai, found face down by early explorers, an act of intentional internal destruction that reveals the spiritual bankruptcy of the final generation. This open loop signifies a violent, desperate rejection of the ancestral obsession that doomed them. The foreshadowing is clear. Any civilization that sacrifices its physical environment for a spiritual or aesthetic monument, believing that mere symbols can ward off ecological fate, is spiritually programming itself for utter ruin and eternal silence. The Mayan crystal skulls and the false oracle. The legendary Mayan crystal skulls embody a unique curse of deceptive artifacts and spiritual manipulation. Although modern science suggests many are fakes, the curse is rooted in the powerful, persistent spiritual influence these objects exerted over those who sought them. The skulls became an eerie symbol of a false oracle, an object of perfect crystal beauty that promised ultimate knowledge and divine connection, but only delivered delusion, greed, and the spiritual destabilization of any who possessed them. The paradox of the crystal skulls is that their perfection, the flawlessness of their carving, made them the ultimate self-sabotage, an invitation for charlatans and spiritual hucksters to impose their will. Each one is a haunted or cursed artifact, the clarity of the crystal amplifying the chaotic desires of its current owner while simultaneously blinding them to the ultimate necessary truth. The curse ensured that those obsessed with the skulls would chase an illusory past, ignoring the complex real-world historical records left by the Mayan people. The enduring open loop is the continued belief in their ancient power, creating a persistent modern spiritual vacuum. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization, or any successor culture, that seeks ultimate truth through spectacular simplified symbols rather than through the hard work of genuine historical and spiritual inquiry, will always find itself manipulated. The recurring motif of the perfect staring crystal eye is the final, cold contrast between silence and revelation, silently judging all who are foolish enough to trust a silent, beautiful lie. The Phaistos disc and the time-locked message. The Phaistos disc, a bizarre clay artifact from Minoan Crete covered in stamped unique hieroglyphs, carries a chilling curse of time-locked knowledge. The curse is rooted in the profound spiritual isolation of the message itself. It is the only known text of its kind, created using a unique printing technique that was never repeated. The paradox is that the message was intentionally created to be permanent, yet the technology used to make it was immediately abandoned, ensuring the knowledge was perfectly sealed and made instantly unreadable. The disc is the ultimate eerie symbol of a spiritual influence that desired communication but loathed comprehension. It represents an act of self-sabotage, a singular, powerful scream into the silence of history, followed by a deliberate destruction of the voice and the method of interpretation. This makes the disc a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly preserving a message that is spiritually guaranteed to remain an eternal open loop, forever taunting its discoverers with the weight of uncomprehended pivotal information. The chilling contrast between silence and revelation is the physical perfection of the disc, which survives intact, yet reveals absolute, frustrating silence when asked to yield its meaning. This foreshadowing is clear. Any civilization that possesses a truth so fundamental it cannot be integrated into the existing spiritual or linguistic framework is spiritually condemned to seal that truth away, ensuring its eventual disappearance. The analogy is a massive, complex key to the Minoan soul, deliberately thrown into the well of time, the lost colony of Roanoke and the word of exile. The disappearance of the Roanoke colonists left behind a curse of abrupt, absolute erasure, centered on a single terrifying word, Croatoan. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the surrounding ancient wilderness, a subtle indigenous power that simply rejected the European intrusion, causing a collective internal self-sabotage that led to a mass flight or dissolution. The absence of a struggle and the single carved word serve as an eerie symbol of a final, spiritual judgment passed by the land itself upon the unwelcome settlers. The terrifying paradox is that the word Croatoan was carved at the very place meant to represent new life and expansion, turning the settlement into a haunted or cursed artifact of spiritual failure. The colony did not die by force, it simply vanished, leaving a profound, inexplicable vacuum that terrified all who sought it. This recurring motif of the vanishing settlement is the ultimate self-sabotage, suggesting the colonists' collective will to survive was so utterly broken that they willingly dissolved themselves into the unforgiving, silent landscape. The final open loop of Roanoke is the chilling knowledge that the answer to their fate was likely left for them to find, but was ultimately missed or misinterpreted, creating an eternal, frustrating spiritual query. This foreshadowing is clear. Any invading civilization that attempts to plant its seed on a landscape already holding an ancient, powerful spiritual identity will be judged by the silence of the land. The contrast between silence and revelation is the terrifying quiet of the empty fort, revealing only the single, cryptic, unforgiving word. The Ainu Emishi and the spirit of the unconquered north. The Ainu people of Japan, historically known as Emishi, carry a profound, silent curse of spiritual suppression, the systematic cultural and spiritual influence imposed by the dominant, expanding Japanese state. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the cold, northern wilderness they worshipped, a power that, while protective, also made them spiritually rigid and resistant to the necessary assimilation that might have saved their physical culture. They chose the purity of their spiritual traditions over the pragmatic necessity of political compromise. The paradox of the Ainu is that their fierce, indigenous spiritual identity, the very force that sustained them for millennia, ultimately guaranteed their historical erasure. The ancient sacred rituals dedicated to the bear and the forest became an analogy of a self-sabotage, as the collective energy poured into these exclusive rites prevented them from engaging the external world's changing political realities. Their entire spiritual system became an eerie symbol of an idealized past, incapable of generating a viable, adaptive future in the face of relentless external pressure. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the cultural silence of their descendants, a terrifying testament to a successful, systematic spiritual suppression. The recurring motif of the bear spirit, once a protective force, now becomes a shadowed eye, silently watching the gradual dissolution of their heritage. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that is spiritually tethered only to the absolute purity of its past, refusing to adapt or compromise with the emerging world order, is spiritually committing to a slow, deliberate, and agonizing disappearance into the periphery of history. The Hanging Gardens and the Ephemeral Paradise. The legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, if they existed as described, carried the curse of ephemeral beauty, a magnificent constructed paradise guaranteed to vanish without a trace. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of their construction, a colossal, hydro-engineered display of hubris that defied the desert environment, creating a profound, unsustainable paradox. The entire structure was an analogy of a civilization pouring its vast wealth into an object that was by definition impossible to maintain, ensuring its collapse was merely a matter of time. The gardens, regardless of their actual location, became an eerie symbol of spiritual self-sabotage, a testament to the belief that human power could conjure an eternal illusion of life in the face of a hostile desert reality. The curse ensured that the moment the massive water pumps and maintenance stopped, the entire spiritual edifice would instantly melt back into the dust from which it came. This act of spectacular, deliberate impermanence was a colossal drain on the empire's resources, an ultimate expression of materialism designed to immediately dissolve. The final, terrifying open loop is the complete absence of physical proof for one of the ancient world's most famous wonders, a final contrast between silence and revelation. The silence of the archaeological record reveals the spiritual power of the curse. The structure was designed to be a ghost, a magnificent rumour that could never be definitively found or studied. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that seeks to build its ultimate spiritual statement on an artificial, unsustainable foundation is condemning itself to be erased entirely, leaving only the legend of its fleeting, gorgeous failure. The bog bodies and the peat swamp sacrifice. The numerous perfectly preserved bog bodies of northern Europe, like Tolland Man, carry a chilling curse rooted in the act of peat swamp sacrifice. These were not victims of murder, but ritual offerings, deliberately drowned or killed and then placed into the cold, acidic peat, a spiritual influence that demanded human life in exchange for the continued favour of the chthonic earth. The curse is rooted in this dark, continuous spiritual contract, a self-sabotage that ensured their civilization was built on a persistent, agonizing blood debt to the cold, silent landscape. The terrifying paradox is that the very preservation properties of the peat that kept the bodies in a state of unnatural stasis also turned them into the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts. The bog itself is an analogy of a giant ancient digestive system, a silent entity that patiently swallowed human sacrifices and then held them in an eternal, horrifying vigil. The spiritual toll of continually offering their best and brightest to the dark earth must have created an immense collective paranoia and deep, destabilizing guilt across the entire culture. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the peaceful, almost sleeping appearance of the preserved bodies, revealing the immense ritualistic care taken in their final moments. This recurring motif of the quiet death is the foreshadowing that this civilization's power was directly tied to the scale of its sacrifices. The curse ensured that their civilization would never achieve true ascendancy, remaining perpetually locked in a dark spiritual bargain with the primal, silent forces of the deep, cold earth they could never fully escape. Nostradamus's quatrains and the burden of fragmentation. The curse of Nostradamus's quatrains is a profound spiritual self-sabotage rooted in the intentional fragmentation of prophecy. The prophecies are not clear warnings, but eerie symbols and obscure four-line verses that guarantee only chaos and perpetual unsettling ambiguity. The curse is rooted in the writer's deliberate choice to wrap ultimate truth in layers of linguistic and Historical misdirection, believing the full unvarnished future was too dangerous for the spiritual influence of the common man. The terrifying paradox is that the attempt to convey profound future knowledge resulted only in a perpetual, eternal open loop of historical anxiety. The quatrains are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, designed to be forever on the cusp of relevance, causing every subsequent century to frantically reinterpret them in the shadow of its own catastrophe. The collective energy poured into deciphering the fragmented truth is the self-sabotage, ensuring that focus is always diverted from present dangers toward the futile circular study of a veiled future. The recurring motif of the terrifying half-glimpsed future is the final contrast between silence and revelation that defines the curse. The verses remain silent about the actual details, yet reveal the chilling truth that humanity is forever condemned to believe its greatest crises were already foretold, a knowledge that paralyzes rather than empowers. This foreshadowing is persistent. A civilization that relies on ambiguous, fragmented prophecy will be spiritually consumed by the fear of an inescapable, poorly understood fate, sealing its doom through anxious inaction. The Voynich manuscript and the language of shadows. You stare at the corroded, impossibly complex gears of the Antikythera mechanism and realize the curse is one of forbidden knowledge, a self-sabotage that saw an advanced, ancient understanding of the cosmos violently erased from history. This device, built centuries before its time, is a terrifying haunted or cursed artifact, its complexity suggesting a level of spiritual influence and scientific insight the Greco-Roman world was not ready to possess. The mechanism's sudden loss in a shipwreck was not a random accident but a spiritual act of erasure, a deliberate severing of the intellectual thread by the forces of history that deemed such advanced knowledge too dangerous for humanity. The terrifying paradox of this device is that its genius was its doom. It stood as an analogy of a civilization's capacity for creation that far outstripped its capacity for preservation. Its sophistication, far from inspiring further innovation, likely terrified the prevailing philosophical and spiritual order, which preferred a simple, earth-centered cosmos. The mechanism's technology became an eerie symbol of hubris, a self-inflicted wound where the knowledge itself was perceived as a dark, destabilizing force, guaranteeing its violent removal and subsequent cultural amnesia for nearly 2 millennia. The chilling open loop is the silence of the other similar devices that must have existed, creating a profound, unfillable void in the history of science. The foreshadowing is that great leaps in understanding are always susceptible to being drowned by the prevailing mediocrity of the time. The final contrast between silence and revelation is that the mechanical fragments, recovered from the deep, remain a silent, persistent accusation. The ghost of an algorithm that proves our own history is filled with lost futures we were too spiritually terrified to preserve. The Olmec colossal heads and the weight of the face. The colossal stone heads of the Olmec civilization embody a curse of spiritual servitude, the ultimate terrifying demand of the ruling elite. These massive multi-ton sculptures, each bearing the distinct face of a single ruler, are an eerie symbol of power so absolute it compelled the collective population to pour staggering amounts of labor into creating, moving, and displaying these stone portraits. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of hyper-individualism, a self-sabotage that ensured the entire civilization was dedicated to the eternal elevation of a select few faces. The terrifying paradox is that the effort required to honor the rulers' identities led directly to the collective exhaustion and eventual fragmentation of the civilization. Each head is a haunted or cursed artifact, imbued with the immense wasted energy of the populace and the crushing weight of a spiritual system that demanded the body's full subservience to the face of power. The sheer material arrogance of these enormous monuments created an unsustainable social debt, guaranteeing the people would eventually be crushed by the literal and figurative weight of their leaders' egos. The ultimate contrast between silence and revelation is the final, violent fate of many of the heads, which were found intentionally toppled or defaced, an open loop signifying a furious last-gasp popular rebellion against the centuries of spiritual tyranny. This recurring motif of the shattered face is a chilling foreshadowing. Any civilization that demands the complete, unsustainable spiritual and physical sacrifice of its populace for the singular glorification of its leaders is guaranteed to be consumed by the violence of its own self-inflicted collapse. The Etruscan necropolis and the Silent Watch. The vast, subterranean Etruscan necropoles, magnificent cities built exclusively for the dead, carry a curse of perpetual ancestor worship and spiritual rigidity. The curse is rooted in the overwhelming spiritual influence of the deceased, a self-sabotage that saw the living dedicate disproportionate resources to ensuring the comfort, status, and eternal presence of their dead. The necropolias are an analogy of a civilization tethered to its own graveyard, constantly looking backward for wisdom, preventing the necessary adaptation to the dynamic, dangerous world of the living. The terrifying paradox of the Etruscan civilization is that in achieving a sublime spiritual connection with their ancestors, they weakened their ability to survive the present. The tombs, adorned with intricate, beautiful murals of earthly banquets, are haunted or cursed artifacts, their artwork imbued with the agonizing, silent watch of the shadowed eyes of the dead. The immense collective energy poured into creating this second city, a magnificent, silent metropolis for the departed, drained the civilization of the vitality needed to confront the ascending power of Rome. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the eerie quiet that settles over these underground chambers, revealing a profound and complete spiritual surrender. The Etruscans were not culturally destroyed. They were spiritually absorbed by their own focus on the past. This foreshadowing is clear. A society that commits its greatest architectural and artistic genius to the eternal repose of its dead will find that a younger, more brutal and forward-looking power will eventually inherit the abandoned land of the living, silencing them completely. The city of Troy's 7 layers and the curse of recurrence. The legendary city of Troy carries a unique curse of spiritual recurrence, the horrifying self-sabotage of building a civilization on a doomed spiritual foundation. The 9 layers of the archaeological site reveal a terrifying paradox. After each catastrophic destruction, by war, fire, or earthquake, subsequent generations deliberately rebuilt the new city on the exact same cursed ground. The curse is rooted in this spiritual influence of fatalism, a belief that the city was fated to be a flashpoint, yet perpetually clinging to the exact geography of its demise. The towering excavated layers of Troy are an analogy of a deep-time wound, a haunted or cursed artifact of human stubbornness, where the people chose ritualized repetition over pragmatic survival. Each layer is an eerie symbol of a spiritual self-sabotage, proving that the citizens were more devoted to the legend of Troy than the actual survival of its inhabitants. They believed that by rebuilding in the same place they were honouring the past, but they were actually condemning their future to an inescapable, pre-programmed violent end. The final open loop of Troy is the nagging feeling that the original fatal mistake was replicated 9 times, creating a terrifying spiritual echo across millennia. This recurring motif of violent destruction followed by faithful doomed reconstruction is the chilling foreshadowing. A civilization that fails to spiritually break from the geography and patterns of its past failures is spiritually programmed for infinite recurrence. The very soil is cursed, absorbing the violent energy of each collapse and using it to hasten the next, until the city is finally abandoned in silence. The kingdom of Scylla's gold crowns and the material weight. The ancient Korean kingdom of Scylla possessed a dazzling curse of extreme materialism, symbolized by their massive, delicate crowns made of pure gold. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the gold itself, a dazzling self-sabotage that prioritized ostentatious, impractical material wealth over military and strategic necessity. The crowns are an eerie symbol of this profound spiritual misdirection, created to be impossibly large and fragile, perfect for ritual display but utterly useless for defense, exposing the kingdom's spiritual vanity. The terrifying paradox is that the sheer weight and fragility of the gold crowns, too large to wear in battle, too soft to be functional, turned them into the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts. They became an analogy of the kingdom's leadership, glittering and magnificent on the surface, but profoundly brittle and incapable of adaptation when faced with the hard reality of invasion. The collective energy poured into extracting and crafting this pure, unnecessary gold was energy stolen from the kingdom's true, necessary foundations, its defences and practical infrastructure. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the absolute stillness of the burial mounds that contain these crowns, which reveal the vastness of the gold hoard and the scale of the spiritual self-sabotage. This foreshadowing is chilling. Any civilization that allows its ruling class to become so consumed by the need for spectacular, fragile material display is spiritually guaranteeing that its treasury will one day be emptied by a hardier, less ostentatious foe. The weight of the gold was the weight of their spiritual bankruptcy. The Minoan earthquakes and the god of the shaking earth. The Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete, suffered under a terrifying self-inflicted environmental curse, a profound dependence on a powerful but utterly chaotic supernatural influence, the god of the shaking earth. The civilization constantly rebuilt its cities and palaces over and over again after devastating earthquakes, revealing a spiritual fatalism and self-sabotage rooted in the refusal to abandon their sacred geography. The curse guaranteed that their spiritual power was tied directly to the unstable forces of the planet itself. The terrifying paradox is that the Minoans' greatest architectural feats, the sprawling multi-story palaces like Knossos, were built in the full spiritual certainty that they would be destroyed again. The palaces are haunted or cursed artifacts, imbued with the collective spiritual anxiety of waiting for the next tremor. Their constant rebuilding was an analogy of a collective spiritual sickness, a civilization locked in an open loop of ritualized destruction and reconstruction, guaranteeing that their collective energy was perpetually drained by repairing the physical damage. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the catastrophic, synchronized end that finally consumed them, often attributed to the eruption of Thera, which merely accelerated the inevitable. This recurring motif of the shaking ground is the chilling foreshadowing. A civilization that lives in a state of spiritual dependence on an uncontrollable, chaotic, natural force is spiritually guaranteed to be consumed by it. They did not die because their power failed, but because the god they worshipped finally grew tired of their reverence and swallowed them whole. The Nazca trephination rituals and the body's price. The Nazca people, already cursed by their sky-gazing obsession, inflicted a second profound spiritual self-sabotage through their ritualistic practice of trephination, drilling holes into the living skull. The curse is rooted in the terrifying belief that such a brutal, physically dangerous act was required to release evil spirits or cure spiritual ailments, creating a brutal spiritual influence that demanded the body itself be violated for the soul's supposed benefit. The act was a harrowing, eerie symbol of a desperate spiritual debt paid in bone and life. The terrifying paradox is that the very ritual intended to save the soul was physically likely to kill the body, a spiritual contract with a near-zero success rate. The trephined skulls, showing evidence of healing, are haunted or cursed artifacts, silent witnesses to a culture driven to an extreme form of spiritual therapy that bordered on collective psychosis. The spiritual energy and focus poured into this brutal, surgical self-sabotage was energy diverted from more practical, life-saving pursuits, ensuring the civilization's overall health declined even as its spiritual desperation peaked. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the unsettling prevalence of the healed skulls, which reveal the extreme resilience and belief system of the culture. This open loop leaves us with the foreshadowing that a civilization caught in a spiritual crisis will inevitably turn its violence inward, believing the solution lies in the destruction or mutilation of its own people. The open holes in the bone are the shadowed eyes of a culture that believed the truth of the universe could only be seen by looking directly into the exposed brain. The Roman lead pipes and the silent poison. The curse of the Roman Empire was not an external invasion, but a silent, pervasive, self-inflicted poison rooted in their magnificent engineering of water distribution. The use of lead, plumbum in their aqueduct system, pipes, and cookware created a constant low-level spiritual influence of neurological self-sabotage that quietly permeated the collective consciousness. The curse ensured that the very efficiency and technological genius that sustained the empire became the subtle mechanism of its slow, agonizing, internal decay. The terrifying paradox is that the Roman mastery of water technology, intended to prolong and civilize life, simultaneously introduced the neurotoxin that undermined their wisdom, stability, and future. The lead pipes are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, their complex network an analogy of a brilliant civilization unknowingly building its own slow chemical executioner into the bedrock of its infrastructure. The self-sabotage was a slow spiritual hemorrhage, dulling the minds of its elites and citizens over centuries, making them less capable of rational decision-making. The final recurring motif of the poisoning is the inexplicable series of mad, unpredictable, and incompetent emperors whose psychological instability may have been chemically induced. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that fails to check the long-term subtle toxicity of its own innovations is spiritually guaranteed to be devoured by them. The magnificent engineering of Rome, admired for centuries, was the silent, internal, eerie symbol of a civilization that literally poisoned its own great mind into oblivion. The Black Shroud of Turin and the Spiritual Deception. The Shroud of Turin carries a devastating spiritual curse of perfect manipulative deception. Regardless of its authenticity, the Shroud has acted as a powerful spiritual influence over millions, a self-sabotage rooted in the human need for a tangible, ultimate eerie symbol of faith. The curse is rooted in the demand for proof, forcing the relic to be forever shrouded in scientific and spiritual ambiguity, creating a profound, eternal open loop of frustrating, destabilizing inquiry. The terrifying paradox is that the object's power is entirely dependent on its inability to be definitively proven or disproven. The shroud is the ultimate haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly designed to capture the spiritual energy of belief while simultaneously resisting any clarity that might resolve the question. The collective human energy poured into this debate is the self-inflicted spiritual wound, ensuring that the focus remains on the physical relic rather than the actual necessary message of the faith it claims to represent. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the unsettling image of the figure on the cloth, which reveals nothing of the final truth of life, only the agonizing, silent process of death. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that seeks to anchor its deepest spiritual truths to a single, contested, material object is spiritually condemning itself to eternal division and confusion. The black sepia stain on the linen is the recurring motif of spiritual manipulation, a ghost image that perfectly feeds the human need for a tangible lie. The lost Roman legion of Cari and the Ghost Army. The 20-year disappearance of the final remnants of the Roman Legionum Hispana, last seen marching into the deserts of the East after the catastrophic defeat at Cari, carries a curse of absolute total erasure. The curse is rooted in the collective spiritual self-sabotage of the military machine, the inability to accept the final humiliating destruction of a unit, which forced the entire empire to participate in the spiritual influence of a lie. The Legion's fate is an analogy of the empire's fragility, a terrifying vacuum where a massive military force simply ceased to exist. The terrifying paradox is that the shame of the defeat was so profound that the Empire chose to erase the Legion from its records rather than admit the loss, turning the phantom soldiers into a ghost army. The missing men are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, their spectral presence remaining an open loop that destabilized the Empire for decades. The deliberate act of erasing a massive part of the fighting force was a spiritual self-sabotage that created a psychological vulnerability, the terrifying knowledge that Rome could not only be beaten, but could have its finest completely consumed without a trace. The final recurring motif of the vanishing soldiers is the contrast between silence and revelation. The silence of the records conceals the horrible, unadmitted truth that the desert and the enemy swallowed an entire legion whole, proving Roman power was not absolute. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization built on the illusion of invincible military strength is spiritually guaranteed to be consumed by the one defeat it refuses to acknowledge. The missing legion became the shadowed eyes of a military machine watching its own inevitable demise. the Aztec sunstone and the curse of time's end. The massive carved Aztec sunstone or calendar stone embodies a profound curse rooted in the belief in cyclical doom. The curse is the spiritual influence of the 5 suns, the horrifying conviction that the world has already ended 4 times and is spiritually guaranteed to be destroyed again by seismic cataclysm. The stone itself is an analogy of a ticking spiritual clock, a constant, paralyzing self-sabotage that ensured the entire civilization was dedicated not to progress, but to ritualistically delaying the inevitable predetermined end. The terrifying paradox of the Sunstone is that the knowledge of the cosmos they achieved only reinforced their fate. The calendar is a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly preserving the terrifying recurring motif of cosmological violence and human sacrifice required to appease the forces of time. The immense collective spiritual energy poured into maintaining the ritualistic cycle was a crippling debt, guaranteeing that their society was always on the precipice of cultural psychosis, consumed by the certainty of the world's final, violent tremor. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the stone's perfect geometric layout, which reveals the frightening order of the universe, but remains absolutely silent about any hope of escape. This foreshadowing is chilling. A civilization that bases its entire spiritual identity on the inevitability of its own destruction is spiritually guaranteeing that it will not possess the collective will to fight when the true, final calamity arrives. The stone's central, gaping mouth is the open loop, silently waiting to consume the final generation. The Great Wall of China and the curse of the unfinished boundary. The immense serpentine structure of the Great Wall of China carries a profound curse of paralyzing paranoia and spiritual self-sabotage. The curse is rooted in the overwhelming, collective spiritual influence that demanded a permanent physical boundary be erected against the chaotic, untamed forces of the north. The wall, despite its grandeur, became an analogy of a massive psychological barrier that eventually divided the Chinese people from the spiritual wisdom and martial vitality of the nomadic horsemen they sought to exclude. The terrifying paradox of the Great Wall is that the ultimate symbol of collective defense became the ultimate source of internal weakness. The stone structure is a haunted or cursed artifact, with every mile imbued with the agony of the millions of forced laborers and the immense wasted resources. The self-sabotage was a constant, crippling drain on the Empire's treasury and manpower, ensuring that the true threat came not from the external enemy, but from the internal spiritual and economic exhaustion caused by maintaining the impossible, unending boundary. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sight of the wall's silent decay across the mountains, revealing the ultimate terrifying truth. The wall could never truly be finished. This recurring motif of the endless, uncompleted task is the foreshadowing. A civilization that seeks to solve a political or spiritual problem with an impossible material solution is spiritually doomed to perpetual, debilitating effort. The Great Wall is the eerie symbol of a people who built themselves into a magnificent, eternal prison. The sinking of Atlantis and the curse of idealism. The legend of Atlantis carries a curse of catastrophic, instantaneous self-destruction, rooted in its absolute spiritual idealism. The curse is rooted in the belief that a civilization could achieve perfect technological and spiritual harmony, a profound self-sabotage that blinded them to the inevitable corruption of ultimate power. Atlantis is an eerie symbol of hubris, an analogy of a spiritual influence that believed itself to be above the natural, chaotic laws of the world, guaranteeing a violent, absolute and total self-inflicted judgment from the forces of the ocean. The terrifying paradox of Atlantis is that its technical mastery became the engine of its doom. The civilization did not fall due to war, but by the catastrophic failure of its own hyper-sophisticated infrastructure, its crystal-powered core, or its water-based engineering. The entire island became a haunted or cursed artifact, the spiritual energies of its pure ideals and technological power converging in a singular, devastating implosion. The curse ensured that the destruction was so absolute, it could only survive as a fragmented, spiritualized memory, never a tangible fact. The final open loop of Atlantis is the eternal nagging question of its location. the spiritual secret that humanity is perpetually prevented from finding. This foreshadowing is clear. Any civilization that achieves a level of spiritual and technological perfection that removes it from the chaotic, messy reality of the world is spiritually programmed to be swallowed whole. The memory of Atlantis is the recurring motif of the perfect ephemeral paradise, a warning that the pursuit of flawlessness guarantees a violent, total collapse into the silent deep. The Zoroastrian towers of silence and the curse of exposure. The ancient Zoroastrian practice of leaving the dead exposed atop the towers of silence, Dakma, carries a profound curse of spiritual vulnerability. The curse is rooted in the sacred demand for absolute material purity, which decreed that a corpse must not pollute the holy elements of earth or fire. This profound spiritual influence created a terrifying paradox. The act of perfect ritual purity was simultaneously a devastating act of self-sabotage, exposing the civilization to the chaotic, unpredictable forces of disease, carrion, and public shame. The towers themselves, high, circular structures, are eerie symbols of this spiritual self-sabotage, monuments dedicated to a purification process that was both absolutely necessary to their faith and absolutely horrifying to outsiders. They are haunted or cursed artifact, silent witnesses to the agonizing process of the soul's final liberation through the destruction of the body by the elements. The collective spiritual energy poured into maintaining this purity created an immense, paralyzing cultural rigidity that resisted all external pressure to modernize or compromise their ancient, terrifying rites. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sight of the open sky above the towers, revealing the stark, undeniable truth of human mortality and decay. This recurring motif of the sky burial is the chilling foreshadowing. A civilization that anchors its core spiritual identity in a ritual that is universally seen as barbaric by a dominant external force is spiritually guaranteeing its own isolation and eventual suppression. The silent, exposed ritual became the shadowed eyes that watched their slow, agonizing cultural decline. The Samaritan Pentateuch and the Curse of Schism. The Samaritan Pentateuch, a unique version of the first 5 books of the Bible, embodies a profound curse of spiritual division and irreconcilable rivalry. The curse is rooted in the self-sabotage of schism. The moment two groups with the same core spiritual text chose division over unity, guaranteeing centuries of destructive theological warfare. The text itself is a haunted or cursed artifact, the subtle, powerful differences in its wording becoming the spiritual influence that locked two kindred peoples into a state of perpetual, unforgiving enmity. The terrifying paradox is that the shared sacred history, intended to be a source of unity, was weaponized to become the absolute cause of division. The difference in the holy texts became an analogy of an internal spiritual wound that could never heal, an eternal open loop of theological self-sabotage. The collective spiritual energy of both groups was continuously drained by the need to prove the other side was fundamentally wrong, ensuring that neither tradition could focus its full strength on external threats or true spiritual ascendancy. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sheer survival of the tiny Samaritan community today, which reveals the devastating spiritual toll of schism. They are a fragile, isolated remnant of a once great faith. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that pours its entire spiritual resource into the subtle, internal fight over the correct wording of its holy text is spiritually guaranteeing that its power will be fragmented and its numbers will be permanently reduced to a shadow of their potential, consumed by the fight itself. The Crystal Palace fire and the curse of ephemeral progress. The spectacular, total destruction of London's Crystal Palace by fire carries a devastating modern curse of ephemeral progress. The palace, a colossal structure of iron and glass built for the Great Exhibition, was an eerie symbol of humanity's ultimate faith in technology and material science. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of this hubris, the belief that the age of fragile physical wonders could be rendered permanent, a self-sabotage that was brutally and completely revealed by the unstoppable, consuming fire. The terrifying paradox of the Crystal Palace is that the very materials designed to showcase and celebrate the future glass and iron guaranteed its catastrophic instantaneous demise. The structure became a haunted or cursed artifact, its total consumption by fire a final spiritual judgment on the naive belief in material invincibility. The self-sabotage was the realization that the greatest achievements of the industrial age could be dissolved back into elemental chaos faster than they were constructed, creating an immediate, crushing psychological trauma. The final recurring motif of the fire's spectacular consumption is the terrifying contrast between silence and revelation. The brief moment of its magnificent shimmering existence versus the total, absolute silence of the ashes. This foreshadowing is chilling. Any civilization that places its ultimate spiritual faith in massive, complex material structures is spiritually guaranteed to be consumed by the fire of its own technological fragility. The palace's memory remains an analogy of the beautiful, brief, and tragic failure of material optimism, the Mithric mysteries and the curse of secrecy. The elaborate secretive rites of the Roman Mithric mysteries carry a profound, dark curse of spiritual exclusion. The cult, widespread and powerful in the Roman military, was rooted in the self-sabotage of absolute secrecy, a spiritual influence that demanded the core truths and power of the god Mithras be revealed only to the initiated few, excluding women, families, and the wider populace. The curse guaranteed that their profound spiritual power would be politically and socially fragile, incapable of sustaining itself when the external tides turned. The terrifying paradox is that the very secrecy that gave the cult its spiritual intensity and elite status was the mechanism of its total destruction. The underground Mithraea, dark hidden temples, are haunted or cursed artifacts, imbued with the intense, focused spiritual energy of the exclusively male rituals. The self-sabotage was the refusal to universalize their worship, creating an analogy of a burning, focused spiritual light that was easily extinguished because it was trapped in a narrow physical cave, unable to spread its power to the full population. The final open loop of the Mithric mysteries is the enduring silence of its core doctrines, the secrets that died with the last initiates. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that empowers a secretive, exclusive spiritual tradition, one that prioritizes ritual brotherhood over universal community, is spiritually guaranteeing that its influence will vanish completely, leaving behind only the cold, empty shells of its hidden temples. The shadowed eyes of the carved bull sacrifice remain, watching the silence of the abandoned shrines. The Khmer city of Angkor and the curse of Hydro-Hubris. The massive city of Angkor and its breathtaking temples carry a devastating environmental curse, the self-sabotage of Hydro-Hubris. The curse is rooted in the overwhelming spiritual influence of water control, a belief that the Khmers could indefinitely manage a colossal, complex system of reservoirs, canals, and dikes to sustain their empire. The entire civilization was an analogy of a massive, perfectly balanced machine, spiritually guaranteed to shatter the moment one vital component of the hydraulic network failed. The terrifying paradox of Angkor is that its staggering hydraulic engineering, its genius for water management, became the catalyst for its ruin. The massive barrays, reservoirs, and canals are haunted or cursed artifacts, imbued with the spiritual weight of a people who forgot that nature is chaotic and unforgiving. The self-sabotage was the unsustainable complexity. A massive drought or an over-reliance on a single, aging system would cascade into total ecological collapse, leading to a spiritual fragmentation and massive famine from which the empire could never recover. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sight of the temples consumed by the jungle, their stone roots revealing the ultimate truth that the stone, not the water, was the true victor. This recurring motif of the jungle's quiet consumption is the foreshadowing. A civilization that builds its spiritual and material power on an impossibly complex man-made system of resource control is spiritually guaranteeing that nature will eventually reclaim its sovereignty. The silence of the abandoned canals is the final eloquent testament to their hubris. The Roman Vestal Virgins and the curse of imposed purity. The Vestal Virgins of Rome carried a profound internal curse of spiritual repression. The curse is rooted in the extreme, unsustainable demand for absolute, lifelong purity which was believed to guarantee the spiritual security of the entire Roman state. This spiritual influence created a terrifying paradox. The Vestals were given immense political and social power, but only on the condition of a crippling, unnatural self-sabotage, the absolute renunciation of human connection and physical love. The terrifying analogy of the Vestal system is a massive spiritual engine whose power was derived from forcing a handful of women to live in a state of impossible, permanent suspension of their natural human existence. The underground vault containing the eternal flame is a haunted or cursed artifact, its flame an eerie symbol of Rome's spiritual debt, fueled by the denial of the Vestals' lives. The collective psychological burden of ensuring the empire's security through the repression of these women created a profound collective cultural guilt. The final open loop of the Vestals is the horrific inevitable fate of a virgin who broke her vow, being buried alive, a final total spiritual rejection by the state she served. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that tries to secure its greatness through the unnatural, repressive, spiritual sacrifice of a select few is spiritually guaranteed to be devoured by the internal chaos caused by that repression. The silence of the buried virgin is the final, terrifying contrast between silence and revelation of Rome's spiritual hypocrisy. The Nazca lines and the curse of the sky god's indifference. The monumental Nazca lines, massive geoglyphs drawn on the Peruvian plain, carry a devastating curse of unanswered prayer. The curse is rooted in the spiritual self-sabotage of the Nazca people, who poured immense collective labour into creating these massive, perfect offerings intended to be seen by the sky gods. The lines are a terrifying analogy of an impossible spiritual debt, a civilization offering its most vital resource, its endless collective labour, to an entity that was completely, absolutely, and eternally indifferent to their fate. The terrifying paradox is that the perfection and scale of the lines were directly proportional to the futility of the offering. Each geoglyph is an eerie symbol of a desperate final plea for water, becoming a haunted or cursed artifact that permanently records the moment a civilization's faith failed. The creation of images only visible from the heavens was a spiritual influence that blinded them to the necessary pragmatic solutions on the ground, ensuring they were ultimately defeated not by a foe, but by a simple, profound, self-inflicted drought. The final recurring motif of the perfect silent figures, the spider, the monkey, the hummingbird, is the chilling contrast between silence and revelation across the plain. The silence of the untouched. Figures reveals the god's absolute indifference. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that pours its entire spiritual resource into creating a perfect, magnificent plea to an empty heaven is spiritually guaranteed to be consumed by the mundane reality it chose to ignore. The lines are the final perfect record of a monumental self-sabotaging faith. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the curse of hidden truth. The ancient Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves at Qumran, embody a terrifying curse of spiritual hoarding. The curse is rooted in the belief that the definitive apocalyptic truth they held, the authentic final word of their sect, was too pure or too dangerous for the spiritual influence of the common world. This profound self-sabotage ensured that the most pivotal texts were deliberately sealed away, guaranteeing they could not influence the course of history, and only emerged centuries later as fragmented, confusing secrets. The scrolls are an analogy of a civilization's fear of its own profound truth, preferring to seal the divine knowledge in a cave rather than risk its corruption by the populace. The terrifying paradox is that the author's obsession with the absolute preservation of their truth resulted in its absolute historical irrelevance for millennia. The jars of scrolls are haunted or cursed artifacts, imbued with the spiritual anxiety of their zealot authors, perfectly designed to create an eternal open loop of frustrating scholarly debate. The collective spiritual energy poured into copying and hiding these texts was a massive self-sabotage, ensuring that their singular, defining spiritual worldview failed to propagate, leaving only the ghost of a rigorous, forgotten religious sect. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the dramatic discovery of the texts, which broke the long silence but created a new, deeper confusion, revealing only a fragmented, complex and unresolvable spiritual history. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that seeks to protect its ultimate truth by burying it will find that history will accept the silence, but reject the belated, confusing whisper. The eerie symbol of the crumbling parchment is the final testament to a truth that preferred the cold safety of the cave to the chaotic warmth of the world. The Sumerian king list and the curse of impossible longevity. The Sumerian king list, an ancient cuneiform text, carries a chilling curse of impossible chronology. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the antediluvian kings, rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods, sometimes over 40,000 years. The text is a profound self-sabotage designed to create an eternal paradox. It provides a historical record, but grounds that history in a terrifying mythic past that makes the subsequent believable reigns seem small and insignificant. The text is an eerie symbol of a civilization using divine falsehood to amplify its political legitimacy. The terrifying, recurring motif of the king list is the immense spiritual weight of the ages that precedes humanity's current fragility. The tablet is a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly preserving the memory of a golden age so perfect and vast that the current fleeting human existence is rendered tragic and meaningless. The self-sabotage was the creation of a spiritual narrative that ensured the civilization would always compare its brief, flawed existence to the eternal perfection of the mythical past, ensuring a collective sense of failure and decline. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the abrupt chronological shift in the list, where the reigns suddenly become short in human scale after the Great Flood. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that bases its founding myth on an impossible superhuman past is spiritually guaranteeing that its living history will be seen as nothing more than a slow, agonizing decline. The list is the open loop that constantly reminds us of the spiritual price paid for claiming an origin among the gods, the Etruscan liver and the curse of divination's control. The Etruscan religious practice, centered on the haruspex, diviner, and the perfect bronze model of a sheep's liver, carries a curse of spiritual rigidity. The curse is rooted in the pervasive spiritual influence of scrupulous, unending divination, which demanded that every major political and military decision be subjected to the perfect reading of the liver's spots and fissures. The bronze model is an analogy of the civilization's self-sabotage, a culture so obsessed with perfectly reading the future that it failed to act pragmatically in the present. The terrifying paradox is that the immense spiritual energy poured into perfecting the art of prediction guaranteed their ultimate defeat. The bronze liver is a haunted or cursed artifact, imbued with the paranoia of centuries of spiritual debt, forever commanding the living to wait for the perfect sign before acting. This collective hesitation, born from the spiritual fear of violating the divine will, ensured that the Etruscan military was always one step behind the younger, more pragmatic and less spiritually encumbered Roman legions. The final, recurring motif of the diviner's scrupulous study is the chilling contrast between silence and revelation. The liver provided immense, terrifyingly precise knowledge about the fate of the moment, yet revealed absolute silence about how to change that fate. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that sacrifices its sovereign decision-making to the spiritual control of ritualized fortune-telling is spiritually guaranteeing its own slow, inevitable conquest by a more decisive, ruthless power. The bronze liver became the shadowed eyes that paralyzed their will. The Black Death and the curse of mass casualty. The historical cataclysm of the Black Death carries a profound curse of spiritual trauma rooted in the sudden, overwhelming scale of death. The curse is rooted in the supernatural influence of the plague itself, which did not merely kill bodies, but completely shattered the collective spiritual and theological framework of the medieval world. The plague was a massive external wound that led to an internal self-sabotage, the complete abandonment of spiritual faith in the face of a god who seemed either non-existent or inexplicably cruel. The terrifying paradox of the plague is that the very piety and spiritual fervour of the age amplified the physical contagion. The masses praying together guaranteed the spread of the disease. The plague is an analogy of a civilization's spiritual foundation collapsing under the sheer weight of unbearable evidence. The constant sight of indiscriminate death turned the living into eerie symbols of profound guilt and paranoia, creating a spiritual vacuum that gave rise to wild, self-flagellating cults and a profound, lasting cultural psychosis. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the staggering historical silence in the records following the plague, a massive intellectual and cultural void that revealed the scale of the spiritual trauma. This open loop ensured that the subsequent centuries were built on a foundation of profound cultural pessimism and existential anxiety. The recurring motif of the masked plague doctor is the final foreshadowing. A civilization that faces a catastrophe so complete it destroys its shared spiritual framework is spiritually condemning itself to a future of fear, fragmentation, and slow, bitter rebuilding. The sunken city of Yis and the curse of coastal hubris. The legendary Breton city of Yis, swallowed by the sea, carries a curse of spiritual negligence and coastal hubris. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the city's unique reliance on a single, massive sea gate, a self-sabotage that entrusted the city's very existence to a single, easily compromised mechanism. The city is an eerie symbol of a civilization so arrogant in its wealth and engineering that it believed it could permanently hold back the chaotic, fluid power of the ocean, guaranteeing a final catastrophic betrayal from the sea. The terrifying paradox of Waz is that its legendary magnificence, built on the reclaimed land of the sea, sealed its doom. The massive sea gate is a haunted or cursed artifact, the literal weak point where the spiritual corruption and arrogance of the royal family converged with the destructive will of the ocean. The collective spiritual energy poured into the city's opulence and defence was all rendered instantly moot by the single crucial moment of betrayal, the spiritual flaw in the ruler's daughter, which provided the ultimate open loop for the sea to reclaim its sovereignty. The final recurring motif of the church bells ringing from the depths is the chilling contrast between silence and revelation, revealing the city's eternal, watery vigil. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that places its ultimate trust in a single, magnificent mechanical solution to a profound spiritual and environmental challenge is spiritually guaranteeing its total, instantaneous, and irrevocable annihilation. The sunken city of Yais is an analogy of a wealth built on denial, forever calling out in the dark, cold silence of the deep. The Roman pantheon's oculus and the curse of the open eye, the massive central open hole, oculus, of the Roman pantheon carries a profound atmospheric curse of spiritual exposure. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of this singular, architectural self-sabotage, a deliberate unroofed opening that ensured the magnificent, all-encompassing dome was forever vulnerable to the chaotic, untamed forces of nature. The oculus is an analogy of the empire's flaw, a spiritual insistence on a singular, perfect connection to the heavens, even at the cost of its own internal physical security. The terrifying paradox is that the architectural perfection of the dome is perpetually undermined by the calculated imperfection of the whole. The pantheon is a haunted or cursed artifact, its immense space imbued with the collective spiritual anxiety of facing the elements, forever receiving rain and storm within its sacred confines. The spiritual self-sabotage ensured that the temple of all the gods was forever exposed to the whims of the supernatural influence of a single chaotic sky god, guaranteeing that the structure could never be perfectly closed off or fully controlled. The final recurring motif of the light pouring into the dark space is the chilling contrast between silence and revelation, which reveals the truth that the Roman state preferred the magnificent illuminated truth to the mundane safety of a ceiling. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that intentionally leaves a massive structural vulnerability in its most sacred edifice, believing the flaw is necessary for spiritual transcendence, is spiritually guaranteeing its own slow internal decay. The open oculus is the shadowed eyes that watch the empire's internal spiritual exposure. The library of Ashurbanipal and the curse of the cuneiform tablets. The royal library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, containing thousands of cuneiform tablets, carries a curse of material rigidity. The curse is rooted in the spiritual self-sabotage of the medium itself, the use of baked clay to record pivotal knowledge, which guaranteed the texts were perfectly preserved, but also impossibly heavy, fragile, and difficult to copy or distribute. The library is an analogy of a civilization that prioritized the absolute, permanent authority of its knowledge over the necessary, fluid spread of its wisdom to the rest of the world. The terrifying paradox of the cuneiform tablet is that its perfect preservation ensured its total intellectual isolation. Each tablet is a haunted or cursed artifact, imbued with the spiritual weight of unread history, perfectly designed to withstand fire and conquest, only to be rendered irrelevant by linguistic change. The collective spiritual energy poured into creating and organizing this magnificent hoard of clay was a crippling debt, ensuring that the civilization's defining knowledge was simply too massive and slow to transition to new, cheaper, faster mediums. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the moment the library was finally excavated, revealing the monumental scope of the knowledge that had been silent for millennia. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that anchors its ultimate spiritual legacy to a physical medium that is too difficult to replicate and share is spiritually condemning itself to total obscurity. The recurring motif of the fragmented clay tablets is the final, eloquent testament to a knowledge that survived everything except the necessary, vital act of communication. The Roman curse tablets and the curse of written malice. The Roman defictiones, or curse tablets, small lead sheets inscribed with pleas to dark underworld gods for vengeance, carry a chilling curse of spiritual weaponization. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of self-sabotage. The moment a civilization's populace chooses to solve mundane personal problems through the ritualized, written invocation of malevolent supernatural forces. The tablets are an eerie symbol of a society whose spiritual foundation had become so corrupted that malice became a common, administrative act. The terrifying paradox is that the very act of writing the curse, intended to harm an enemy, created a reciprocal negative spiritual debt for the entire culture. Each tablet is a haunted or cursed artifact, its thin lead sheet imbued with the intense spiritual energy of private hatred and envy, collectively poisoning the spiritual atmosphere of the empire. The self-sabotage was the collective spiritual energy poured into seeking petty, dark vengeance, ensuring that the entire Roman world was constantly saturated in the low, humming frequency of ritualized spite and spiritual decay. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sight of the tablets found tossed into wells and graves, revealing the common, casual extent of the private spiritual warfare being waged beneath the official facade. This recurring motif of the buried malice is the foreshadowing. A civilization that fails to find ethical, communal resolutions to its personal strife will spiritually guarantee its own consumption by private, vengeful chaos. The silent, rolled-up lead sheet is the open loop that constantly leaks the dark energy of 1,000 petty spiritual self-destructions. The Heike crab and the curse of genetic remnant. The Japanese Heike crab, Heikegani, carries a profound, subtle curse of genetic spiritual inheritance. The curse is rooted in the supernatural influence of mass, ritualized spiritual trauma, the devastating naval defeat of the Heike clan in 1185, which saw the warriors drown, themselves to avoid surrender. The subsequent generations of fishermen, refusing to catch crabs whose shells bore a distinct pattern, resembling a scowling samurai face, created an unintentional genetic self-sabotage by selectively breeding the image of their vengeful drowned ancestors into the species. The terrifying paradox is that the powerful spiritual influence of the drowned Heike warriors found its eternal, genetic embodiment in a living, edible creature. The crab is the ultimate haunted or cursed artifact, its shell an eerie symbol of the collective spiritual debt owed to the defeated clan. The self-sabotage was the belief that they could control nature through spiritual fear, resulting in a recurring motif where the living were forced to perpetually confront the furious, unblinking, shadowed eyes of the spiritual past every time they pulled their nets from the sea. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the physical persistence of the samurai face on the crab's carapace, a living genetic record of historical trauma. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that suffers a spiritual trauma so absolute that it is transferred into a physical biological mechanism is spiritually guaranteeing that the haunting will be permanent and inescapable. The Heike Crabe is an open loop of history, forever testifying to the self-inflicted spiritual wound of ritualized, dramatic final surrender. The Aztec Flower Wars and the Curse of Ritualized Conflict. The Aztec Xochiaoyotl, or Flower Wars, ritualized, prearranged conflicts intended primarily to capture victims for sacrifice, carry a profound curse of spiritual paralysis. The curse is rooted in the self-sabotage of ritualized conflict, the belief that warfare could be limited, controlled, and used as a predictable source of spiritual sustenance rather than a final, decisive military act. The wars are an analogy of a civilization that became so spiritually dependent on the spectacle of controlled violence that it lost the ability to wage true, existential war. The terrifying paradox is that the constant limited ritual of the Flower Wars created a terrifying spiritual influence of overconfidence. The entire Aztec military machine became an eerie symbol of spiritual rigidity, perfectly designed for ritualized conflict, but entirely unprepared for the brutal, decisive, winner-take-all warfare brought by the Spanish. The self-sabotage was the collective spiritual energy poured into maintaining this predictable ceremonial slaughter, ensuring that their greatest military strength was the one that was least capable of adapting to a new, chaotic, and ruthless enemy. The final recurring motif of the ritual battlefield is the chilling contrast between silence and revelation, the silence of the ritual rules being broken by the sudden, unforgiving brutality of the European invaders. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that allows its spiritual and military systems to become trapped in the elegant, predictable pattern of ritual is spiritually guaranteeing its own sudden and complete destruction by an outside force that plays by no rules. The Flower Wars were the perfect self-inflicted spiritual defeat. The Library of Alexandria and the Curse of Paper's Fragility. The true curse of the Library of Alexandria is not the fire that destroyed it, but the devastating, self-inflicted spiritual influence of ephemeral media. The curse is rooted in the decision to anchor the civilization's collective spiritual and intellectual legacy to the fragility of papyrus scrolls, guaranteeing that centuries of wisdom could be erased in a single afternoon. The library itself was an analogy of a massive intellectual debt, a concentration of forbidden knowledge so immense that its physical vulnerability became a self-sabotage, ensuring that human wickedness or simple accident could trigger a profound, irreversible loss of history. The terrifying paradox of the Great Library is that its singular, unmatched intellectual value made it the ultimate target for forces of chaos and ignorance. The collected scrolls are the final, haunted or cursed artifacts, their loss creating an eternal spiritual vacuum where future progress should have resided. The collective spiritual energy poured into gathering and transcribing these priceless texts was all rendered into ash by a final, catastrophic judgment, a spiritual influence that decreed a single, monolithic repository of knowledge was too dangerous to survive the messy, chaotic trajectory of human history. The final open loop of the library is the eternal nagging question of the lost texts, the terrifying knowledge we are perpetually prevented from finding. This recurring motif of the intellectual void is the chilling foreshadowing. A civilization that fails to distribute and democratize its core wisdom is spiritually condemning itself to a single, total, and permanent obliteration. The silence that followed the fire is the ultimate contrast between silence and revelation, testifying to the fragility of genius when guarded by paper and political whim. The Siberian Ice Maidens and the Curse of the Frozen Past. The Pazeric culture's Siberian Ice Maidens, preserved in permafrost tombs, carry a profound, dark curse of unnatural stasis. The curse is rooted in the supernatural influence of their burial rites, a spiritual act intended to ensure the perfect frozen preservation of the body for the afterlife, which resulted in a massive unintended spiritual self-sabotage. The tomb itself is a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly designed by the forces of the high, cold earth to seize the living, transient moment and lock it forever into a state of silent, unchanging death. The terrifying paradox of the Ice Maidens is that their bodies, tattooed and preserved with astounding detail, are a perfect physical record of a civilization that otherwise vanished without a trace. Their unnatural stasis is an eerie symbol of a spiritual tradition so powerful it resisted the laws of decay, yet the cost was the total obliteration of the culture's living memory. The collective spiritual energy poured into creating this perfect frozen snapshot of the past ensured that no viable future could ever emerge from their descendants, guaranteeing their absorption by the relentless northern chaos. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the shocking detail of the preserved tattoos, which reveals a terrifying glimpse of a lost complex spiritual worldview, only to descend immediately back into the silence of the cold. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that pours its spiritual genius into creating a perfect, eternal memorial to its dead is spiritually guaranteeing that its living history will be consumed by the silence of the ice. The maidens are the shadowed eyes of a past that refused to rest. Perpetually watching the world, they left the Oracle of Delphi and the curse of ambiguous truth. The Oracle of Delphi and the Pythia who spoke for her carried a terrifying curse of spiritual ambiguity. The curse is rooted in the profound self-sabotage of the divine voice. The spiritual influence of the god Apollo was rendered only in fragmented, maddeningly vague answers, ensuring that the truth was always present, but never actionable. The Oracle's temple is an analogy of a civilization's rigid reliance on a spiritual authority that was designed to paralyze, not empower, forcing the supplicant to choose their own fatal interpretation. The terrifying paradox of the Delphic Oracle is that its absolute spiritual authority was predicated on its absolute continuous lack of clarity. The pronouncements are an eerie symbol of truth weaponized, perfectly designed to ensure that any ensuing disaster could always be blamed on the supplicant's flawed interpretation, never the god's flawed advice. The collective spiritual energy poured into seeking the oracle's wisdom was a crippling debt, guaranteeing that the Greek city-states were perpetually locked in an open loop of paranoid, self-destructive political indecision and misinterpretation. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the eventual, definitive silence of the oracle, which reveals the final truth. The power was never in the answer, but in the human desperation to hear one. This recurring motif of the ambiguous whisper is the foreshadowing. A civilization that relies on a cryptic, unverifiable spiritual source for its core decisions is spiritually guaranteeing its own consumption by chaos. The empty chasm where the Pythia once sat remains, a terrifying vacuum of ultimate uncommunicated truth. The samurai katana and the curse of the spiritual edge. The samurai's katana carries a profound internal curse of spiritual debt. The curse is rooted in the belief that the perfect, devastating sharpness of the blade demanded a reciprocal spiritual influence, a perfect, unwavering martial focus that consumed the warrior's soul. The katana is a haunted or cursed artifact, an analogy of a singular, perfect purpose that demanded the sacrifice of all other human traits, ensuring the samurai became spiritually fragile, unable to adapt to any form of conflict that did not involve the ritualized perfection of the sword. The terrifying paradox of the katana is that its devastating, refined lethality was the mechanism of the samurai's eventual military and spiritual obsolescence. The flawless folded steel is an eerie symbol of spiritual rigidity, perfectly designed to be the ultimate self-sabotage, a perfect weapon for an increasingly irrelevant form of warfare. The collective spiritual energy poured into the ritualistic maintenance and veneration of the sword guaranteed that the warrior class could never transition to the practical, chaotic reality of modern firearms, ensuring their dramatic spiritual end. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sight of the polished, silent blade, which reveals the frightening perfection of its craft, but remains utterly mute about the warrior's destiny. This recurring motif of the absolute edge is the chilling foreshadowing. A civilization that anchors its ultimate spiritual identity to a single, perfect, beautiful instrument of death is spiritually guaranteeing its total, bloody demise when a less spiritual, more pragmatic technology emerges. The katana is the perfect spiritual self-defeat, the Great Emu War and the curse of environmental rejection. The bizarre historical event known as the Great Emu War in 1932 Australia carries a modern curse of environmental self-sabotage and profound hubris. The curse is rooted in the supernatural influence of the vast, indifferent Australian wilderness, which simply rejected the organised, martial force of man in favour of the chaotic, untamed vitality of the emu. The entire event is an eerie symbol of human folly, a magnificent collective act of self-sabotage where the military machine proved utterly incapable against an analogy of natural, chaotic and fluid power. The terrifying paradox of the Emu War is that the organised technical superiority of the military equipment, machine guns and trained soldiers, was rendered completely irrelevant by the simple, non-conforming movement of the birds. The entire conflict is a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly preserving the memory of a spiritual defeat where the collective will of a young nation was hilariously broken by an ancient, indifferent and biologically stubborn foe. The collective spiritual energy poured into the effort was a debt that resulted only in a profound cultural humiliation. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sheer, uncomfortable silence that remains in the official records, revealing a spiritual trauma where humanity was forced to admit a total loss to a simple avian enemy. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that attempts to solve a fluid, ecological, problem with rigid technological force is spiritually guaranteeing a humiliating, catastrophic defeat. The recurring motif of the vanishing emu is the open loop that constantly reminds us of the land's silent, unblinking power, the Baghdad House of Wisdom and the curse of intellectual vulnerability. The destruction of the Baghdad House of Wisdom by the Mongols carries a profound curse of intellectual vulnerability. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of monolithic knowledge, the belief that a single central repository of truth could be permanently protected. The library was a colossal self-sabotage, an analogy of a civilization pouring its entire spiritual resource into a single physical structure that was instantly rendered irrelevant by the blunt, ruthless, and anti-intellectual force of chaos. The terrifying paradox of the House of Wisdom is that its intellectual power, which should have guaranteed its survival, guaranteed its spectacular, devastating destruction. The vast collected works are the ultimate haunted or cursed artifacts, their ashes imbued with the spiritual trauma of the recurring motif of the intellectual void. The self-sabotage was the collective spiritual energy poured into transcribing and storing this wisdom, which allowed the destroyers to inflict a single, surgical wound that severed the continuity of human thought and intellectual progress for centuries. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the horrifying legend of the Tigris River running black with ink from the dissolved scrolls, revealing the spiritual magnitude of the loss. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that places its ultimate spiritual faith in the fragile material form of its knowledge is spiritually condemning itself to a single, total, and permanent intellectual annihilation. The black choked river is the final open loop that constantly leaks the dark energy of unread philosophy and lost scientific secrets. The Petra Sig and the curse of the narrow channel. The ingenious Sig, the single, narrow canyon entrance to the Nabatean city of Petra, carries a profound curse of single-point failure. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the city's reliance on this one, magnificent channel for all access, both physical and hydrological. The Sig is an analogy of a civilization's self-sabotage, a deliberate, arrogant choice to anchor its entire survival to a single, easily blocked or compromised physical flaw, guaranteeing a final catastrophic defeat by an enemy who understood the power of simple, sustained blockade. The terrifying paradox of the Sig is that the channel's sheer dramatic beauty was the ultimate source of its ruin. The narrow, winding canyon is a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly designed to fill the approaching enemy with awe, yet simultaneously reveal the city's crippling vulnerability. The collective spiritual energy poured into carving and protecting this magnificent entrance was energy, stolen from the need for redundant supply lines and multiple escape routes, ensuring that the city was spiritually guaranteed to be besieged into total, absolute silence. The final recurring motif of the towering, unblinking walls of the canyon is the chilling contrast between silence and revelation. This silent stone reveals the magnificent architecture, but screams the final, terrifying truth of the single-point choke. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that pours its ultimate spiritual resource into a single, magnificent, dramatic point of failure is spiritually condemning itself to total siege. The sig is the eerie symbol of a people who chose spectacular vanity over the mundane, necessary wisdom of simple safety. The Tunguska event and the curse of the unseen sky. The massive, mysterious Tunguska event of 1908 carries a terrifying, modern curse of unseen, chaotic judgment from the sky. The curse is rooted in the supernatural influence of the explosion itself, which demolished 80 million trees without leaving an impact crater, a perfect, terrifying act of pure, clean chaos. The event is an eerie symbol of the universe's absolute arbitrary indifference, a self-sabotage that revealed the terrifying vulnerability of a civilization that believed its physical existence was protected from sudden, catastrophic, and completely inexplicable judgment. The terrifying paradox of the Tunguska event is that the massive physical trauma it inflicted created a massive, unfillable open loop of scientific and spiritual speculation. The flattened forest is a haunted or cursed artifact, perfectly preserving the memory of a singular, shattering trauma without providing the necessary truth of its origin. The collective spiritual energy poured into understanding the event was a crippling debt, guaranteeing that humanity would be haunted by the simple fact that a catastrophe of this scale could strike without warning, evidence, or explanation. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sheer, terrifying silence of the aftermath. No crater, no definitive meteor fragments, only the pattern of devastation. This recurring motif of the quiet judgment is the foreshadowing, a civilization that fails to recognize the arbitrary, ruthless, and complete indifference of the cosmos is spiritually condemning itself to be consumed by the next random supernatural influence from the sky. The flattened trees are the shadowed eyes of a planet that suffered a spectacular, total wound from the void. The shamanic drums of the Tungus and the primal echo. The Tungus people, who lived closest to the Tunguska event, carry a primal curse of spiritual debt to the unseen chaos. Their shamanic drums, used to communicate with the spirits of the taiga, are the physical embodiment of a self-sabotage, the civilization's belief that they could contain and control the vast, chaotic spiritual influence of the Siberian wilderness. The drums are a haunted or cursed artifact to them, skin imbued with the immense, terrifying energy of the massive, unexplainable celestial judgment that passed over their land, shattering their spiritual certainty. The terrifying paradox of the shamanic drums is that their ritualistic power, intended to bring order to chaos, failed completely at the moment of ultimate cosmic chaos. The spiritual energy poured into the ritual was a crippling debt, ensuring that the entire spiritual system was rendered permanently suspect in the face of the unexplainable trauma. The drums are an analogy of a civilization whose spiritual language was suddenly and violently severed, leaving only the sound of a terrified, fragmented echo across the devastated, silent taiga. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the terrifying silence that descended over the shamanic tradition after the event, revealing the absolute inability of their spiritual defense to withstand the true, massive power of the cosmos. This foreshadowing is clear. A civilization that attempts to solve a massive physical and cosmic problem with only a localized spiritual tool is spiritually guaranteeing the total destruction of that tool and the eventual dissolution of the spiritual system it represents. The drums remain, an open loop of a question that the cosmos chose not to answer. The Tower of Babel and the curse of the fractured voice. The final curse is the legendary Tower of Babel, the ultimate act of spiritual hubris and devastating self-sabotage. The curse is rooted in the spiritual influence of the collective monolithic voice, a terrifying belief that humanity could achieve spiritual ascent by physical effort and that its unified language could force the heavens to yield their secrets. The tower itself is an analogy of a civilization's single fatal flaw, its absolute arrogant belief that perfection could be achieved without the divine, guaranteeing a catastrophic singular judgment. The terrifying paradox of Babel is that the perfect unified language, intended to be the ultimate eerie symbol of human power, became the mechanism of the curse. The single, catastrophic judgment by the divine was not fire or flood, but the simple, devastating fragmentation of the voice, turning perfect unity into spiritual chaos. The entire human collective was rendered an open loop of permanent confusion, guaranteed to spend the rest of its existence struggling against the curse of mutual, fundamental unintelligibility, a magnificent total spiritual defeat. The final contrast between silence and revelation is the sight of the ruined, abandoned ziggurat, which reveals the simplicity of the divine punishment, a permanent spiritual disunity that continues to plague the modern world. This recurring motif of the fractured voice is the final, chilling foreshadowing for all civilizations. The ultimate curse is the spiritual inability to communicate, ensuring that all future efforts will be trapped in the endless self-sabotaging conflict of 1,000 different, perfect, incomprehensible truths. The silence of the abandoned ruins is the end of the world. The 100 curses are now revealed, not as external judgments, but as a chilling collective echo, the sound of humanity defeating itself. Every crumbling wall, every silent tomb, every lost language is a testament to the spiritual self-sabotage that anchors all civilization. They prove that power, piety, and progress are perpetually undermined by their own shadow, the hubris of the Great Wall, the toxicity of Roman lead, the ambiguity of the oracle. We look upon these vanished civilizations and see not a foreign fate, but a profound, recurring paradox. The ultimate curse is the spiritual flaw we deliberately engineer into the foundations of our greatest achievements. The question that remains is not if our turn will come, but which one of our magnificent self-inflicted spiritual wounds will finally silence us forever.